X. Ichigo entered the industrial district alone. This in of itself wasn't necessarily an unusual fact, as this had happened more than a few times. What was unusual was that one of the Visored was not a step behind Ichigo, nor hiding obtrusively, or parking a vehicle of some kind in a hidden garage. Usually, if Ichigo was heading to the warehouse immediately after school, which occurred weekly, one of the Visored would accompany him. But something had come up, some issue that they felt he didn't need to worry about. Kisuke had offered to walk Ichigo, if only for his own peace of mind, and even Isshin had offered to drop Ichigo off at his training. He had denied the offers. It wasn't too far a walk from the school if he rode the regional bus, and besides Ichigo wasn't helpless and he wasn't defenseless, he had already established his rule over the local Yakuza. It wasn't cockiness. Ichigo knew that Zangetsu wouldn't let anything happen, and Ichigo knew his own strength. When you sparred against Shinigami who had trained for centuries and could beat you in a minute, it was easy to feel humble. The broad light of the early afternoon slanted and wavered over the collection of warehouses near the Visored's base, catching and dragging out the shadows hiding in the dark. Ichigo's hand tightened imperceptibly on the strap of his backpack as his eyes darted around, his Reiatsu reaching around him to sense anything irregular. A few of the more daring idiots had tried to harass Ichigo outside of the district, but there was nothing now, just the cool whistle of wind through the paneling all around him. It was subtle, a barely noticeable distortion of air that could have been mistaken for summer heat if it wasn't the middle of fall. Ichigo's eyes narrowed at the sight, and he could feel Zangetsu shift to attention, the intangible weight of the spirit suddenly behind him, the flicker of cloth, a stormy mix of white and black appearing in the corner of his vision. Allowing his Reiatsu to pool around him like Kisuke had shown him, and decided was the best method, Ichigo stepped cautiously forward. If it was a Kido barrier, it would react when he reached a certain distance. It could be one of Hachi's for proximity or any other manner of things. Or it could be one of Soul Society's. Ichigo didn't know why the Visored were in Karakura, only that they weren't exactly friendly with Soul Society, and that would be warning enough. It could also be a hollow, Ichigo acknowledged as his hand tightened into a fist. Sometimes they had weird quirks beyond size or appendages. There was a spike of Reiatsu, noticeable as it rose amongst the sea of his own Reiatsu, and a snap of instincts that bristled behind his spine. Ichigo darted to the side in a whirl of Shuunpa and turned his attention on his surroundings. There was nothing visible, only deep gouges in the pavement where he had once been standing and a shimmer of heat waves all around him. Tensing slightly, Ichigo forced himself to relax and materialized his Zanpakuto. Ichigo listened to his instincts as they guided him into a roll and to his feet before spinning out with a slash of Zangetsu. Crimson painted the air in an arc as if appearing from nowhere, accompanied by the grating roar of a hollow. But still, nothing was visible. Peering out of the corner of his eye at Zangetsu, Ichigo questioned, "Can you see it?" The spirit shook his head and one hand tugged Ichigo out of the way of a claw. The invisible weapon passing clean through Zangetsu was a somewhat disconcerting image. Ichigo frowned and closed his eyes. If he couldn't see the hollow, then he would have to hear it. Ichigo never thought he would be thankful for the multitude of times Kisuke had blindfolded him in their spars. Ichigo inhaled and exhaled, listening to his surroundings, to the heavy footsteps of the hollow, its harsh breathing, the grind of something, likely a tail, against the pavement, and moved. Zangetsu flashed through the air as Ichigo moved forward in a quick Shuunpa, only for the hollow to disappear. Rolling to his feet, Ichigo frowned. Hollows didn't just teleport, or at least most of them didn't do that, and be invisible. The more powerful ones, called Espada Could, Kisuke called it Sonido. But they were all in Hueco Mundo. With a flash of warning, Ichigo ducked out of the way and spun around Zangetsu, catching once more on the hollow. It was only a shallow wound. Feeling a slight panic start to rise at the back of his throat at the thought of fighting this hollow who was different from the ones he had encountered on patrol, Ichigo took a deep breath and focused on his Reiatsu and what Zangetsu was telling him. Ichigo's spirit wasn't like Benihime, and not just because all spirits were different. Zangetsu was something else, more instinct than logic at times. He knew what it was already, had seen it in Zangetsu's appearance and what they had discovered when they were training on their own. But Ichigo didn't understand it and was content to wait for Kisuke to explain when the man decided it was time. Listening to the snap of Reiatsu, Ichigo rolled under an overhead strike and began to recite the chant for a Kido in his mind. If Ichigo had the right opportunity, he could attempt to blast the hollow with a full-powered shaka. Perhaps that would stop whatever was keeping the creature from being seen. Pressing one hand to his side as Ichigo gathered his Reiatsu, he focused on what Tessai always said during their impromptu despair-filled Kido lessons. Tessai would grin, ruffle Ichigo's hair, and say, "Just focus on one layer at a time, like architecture, each verse is one floor." So, Ichigo did that as he sprinted to the other side of the clearing and hid for a moment in the shade of a warehouse, attempting to catch his breath. The wind whistled, and the air hummed as Ichigo jumped over a low sweeping attack and let Zangetsu whip out with his unoccupied hand. The blade didn't connect. Ichigo could feel that as he whirled away, drawing closer to the last verse. The feel of the Kido was around his hand, hot and burning from the tips of his fingers to his heart. Ichigo waited till he felt the torrent of air pass over his face as he ducked to release the Kido. The shaka burst from his hand in a spark of crimson and collided with the invisible hollow in a flash that forced the creature back with a howl. Ichigo stood for a moment and stared, something inside of him cheering viciously that he had managed to cast the Kido even as his body tensed and he ducked. It was a moment too late, and Ichigo coughed out half of his lung as he collided with one of the warehouse's walls. In a single moment, the air was driven from his lungs and Zangetsu clattered to the ground beside him. Ichigo blinked his eyes open and stared at the blurry image of the world in front of him, even as his instincts were screaming at him to get up, move, or he would die. Then who would he be able to protect? "Ichigo!" A voice called as clumsy fingers grasped weakly at Zangetsu's hilt. Ichigo glanced up and blinked. Mashiro was running towards him, none of the normal bounce in her step. She was sprinting as if she could see the hollow in front of him. She was wearing her mask, the one that they rarely wore, in front of him. Ichigo glanced up, time seeming like molasses in his hands as the air shimmered in front of him and his instincts told like the bells of a city spelling out danger. Suddenly, Mashiro was in front of Ichigo, a burst of Reiatsu that was distinctively not Shinigami accompanying the humming motion as a torrent of Reiatsu surged from her outstretched palm and sliced through the air, and presumably the hollow. It clicked and Ichigo stared up at the green-haired Visored with wide eyes as the invisible hollow crumpled to dust. Mashiro turned, concern written on her features as she crouched in front of him, one hand reaching to close over his own as she smiled at him. It wasn't the normal wide and energetic smile, it was tender. "Are you okay, Ichigo?" Mashiro questioned softly as Ichigo stared at her, the adrenaline from the fight beginning to fade. It left Ichigo with the overwhelming realization of his survival and what the Visored actually were. He managed a rough nod eventually. It was obvious in hindsight, and maybe Ichigo had always known. Their masks, their spirits' gold eyes, the darkest part of them, all of it seemed glaringly obvious. Though in Ichigo's defense, there was no information about how it was even possible, and they surely didn't talk about it. Not to mention, while their spirits were different from Benihime, Zangetsu was different from them. Ichigo just wanted an explanation. A hand appeared in front of Ichigo's eyes, and he glanced up at Mashiro, who was staring at him with furrowed brows and a pout. The energetic woman gently grasped Ichigo's shoulders and with one movement tugged him to his feet. It was easy to forget how strong Mashiro was, Zangetsu's blade dematerializing and fading away as Ichigo let his Reiatsu settle. He could feel his spirit hovering behind him, warm and like an embrace as Mashiro checked him over for injuries. As if on autopilot, Ichigo did the same first, for Mashiro and then himself. Mashiro was unharmed, but Ichigo had some bruising on the back of his skull and a few shallow abrasions from the pavement, though thankfully there was no sign of a concussion. "Let's go back, okay, Ichi?" "Everyone's waiting," Mashiro stated and started to walk, swinging Ichigo's hand in hers as she continued to fill the silence. "Everyone was starting to get worried when you didn't arrive at the usual time." Shinji started pacing, and that's a sign that he was really worried. And then the proximity wards Hachi set up tripped and we were all super worried. Shinji wanted to come himself, but then Hiyuri, well, he was needed along with everyone else. "But they had it handled well enough, so I came." Ichigo processed the jumble of words as he held Mashiro's hand, taking a fraction of comfort in the warmth of her fingers. He wondered now as he recalled their spirits, how he had noticed they were unhealthy. He wondered, and it festered in his mind like the logic problems Benihime gave him. As soon as Ichigo entered the warehouse, he was swamped on all sides by most of the Visored. Hachi was in the forefront, looking both Mashiro and Ichigo over while Shinji hovered over the man's shoulder. Love and Rose were staring in concern on his left, and Lisa was on his right, studying him with those intense eyes of hers. Their spirits weren't visible yet, all the same, the air felt supercharged. "What happened?" Shinji demanded as he bundled Ichigo over to the couch, and Mashiro spoke to Kenshi alone for a moment, their foreheads touching, and hands clasped. Ichigo squished his face up and shrugged, which earned a glare from Shinji accompanied by a raised brow. There was a hollow, but it was invisible, Ichigo stated, and Shinji nodded, likely gathering there was more to the story, if only from Ichigo's still somewhat shocked expression. Ichigo continued, "But the hollow could teleport. I landed a few hits on it, but sometimes it wasn't even where it was supposed to be. Oh. I used chakra on it, and it worked." Shinji smiled at the news, but nodded again, features grim. Ichigo took a breath and frowned, suddenly losing the energy his earlier success had provided him with. The youth continued, "The hollow surprised me, and I hit a wall, no concussion, but I was dazed and couldn't get up. Then Mashiro appeared and she used an energy-based attack to purify the hollow." Shinji's gaze widened at Ichigo's statement, and he could feel the attention of the others at his words. The leader of the Visored surveyed Ichigo once as if to verify his words before his gaze flickered to Mashiro and his eyes narrowed. Ichigo felt the tension in the room skyrocket, like a visible fog settling around him as the others stared at Ichigo with varying expressions he couldn't see but felt where he was squished into the couch cushion. Zangetsu appeared beside Ichigo and wrapped his arms around him as a silence descended, a sort of awkward one that was trying to be dramatic as the Visored stared at each other. Ichigo took the opportunity offered to him and tried to analyze how he felt about the revelation. His mom had been killed by a hollow. The Visored were something between Shinigami and hollow. Ichigo wasn't sure if he was supposed to feel bitter. He didn't hate hollows, did he hate Grand Fisher? Yes. But all hollows? No, how could he? They were souls who had been unable to pass on, and their soul chain had devoured them. It wasn't their fault, in fact, it was the Shinigami's lack of presence in the human world that likely contributed to the growing hollow population, at least that was what Benihime reasoned. But regardless of facts Kisuke had delivered the first night Ichigo had been introduced to Rietsu, he didn't hate hollows. Did he feel bitter about the Visored not telling him? Ichigo wondered for a moment before acknowledging that while they had never confirmed it, they had been plain enough. Ichigo supposed in the end that what bothered him most, as always, drew back to their spirits, to how unhealthy their souls were. He was a protector, a healer. The Visored were family and they were suffering. A pale yellow mug appeared in front of Ichigo's eyes, and he glanced up to see Hachi holding the mug. There was something infinitely warm in the man's eyes, and Ichigo grinned in thanks as he accepted the hot chocolate. Sipping quietly on the warm drink as it seeped its way through the dull layer of shock, Ichigo watched as Shinji and the others spoke in a quiet circle, occasionally glancing at him. The doors to the warehouse slid open with a creak that practically demanded someone oil the hinges. Kisuke stood in the entryway with Yoruichi behind him. The scientist's hat was tipped low over his eyes as he surveyed the room, and Yoruichi stood poised with lethal grace. It was all very dramatic and intimidating. When Kisuke's eyes landed on Ichigo, the man's shoulders untensed and the man strode forward, ignoring the Visored. "Are you okay, Ichigo?" Kisuke questioned, one hand reaching out to ruffle his hair as he crouched in front of Ichigo. Sipping at his hot chocolate, Ichigo nodded, and after peering around for eavesdroppers he asked, "Are they going to continue talking all night or give an explanation?" The man in front of him chuckled, the sound familiar and comforting as it was accompanied by a flash of teeth that formed a grin. Kisuke nodded, something flashing in his eyes, as he asked, "Explain what? How or why part of their souls is hollow?" Ichigo responded, deciding to play the game with Kisuke. Benihime, standing ethereally behind her owner, the long fall of black hair shining in the light, winked once at Ichigo before fading away. Kisuke blinked at the question, tilted his head, bit his lip, furrowed his brow, and finally responded, "That. Yes, that. Mashiro clearly used hollow-based techniques when she defended me. I think that she used Sonido and Sero, but I'm not certain." Ichigo replied and took a sip of his hot chocolate, peering at his uncle over the lip of the yellow mug. Kisuke scratched a hand through his hair, ignoring his hat, and stared at Ichigo before he shook his head and replied, "You are too smart for your own good, Ichigo. But yes, we'll explain everything." In a whisper to himself he added, "It's necessary if you were targeted." Then Kisuke stood up, ruffled Ichigo's hair, and drifted over to speak to Shinji and the group huddle of Visored. Ichigo debated the merit of waiting for them to finish the exclusive discussion over barging in and demanding an answer right away. But the couch was comfy, and he was warm, so Ichigo decided he could wait for 10 minutes and no more. Eventually, they all moved over to the seating area, settling and squishing into place with their collective attention focused on Ichigo. A silence descended, thick and awkward, as if no one could decide who should start first and what to say. "We weren't born like this," Love stated, and Ichigo could feel his gaze from behind the shade of his glasses. The man frowned and continued, "This was forced upon us." Ichigo frowned at the knowledge and wondered how it was possible to change a soul like that. Kisuke tipped his hat over his eyes, shading his face in shadows. He added, "You know that everyone here once held a position in Soul Society, Ichigo. There was, or rather is, a traitor among the Shinigami, Aizen Susuke. He is a genius, a megalomaniac, and incredibly powerful. He's also a right foo-fricking bastard. He's the one who did this to us, has killed and made experiments of others too." Shinji added with a vitriol in his voice Ichigo hadn't heard before. This person, Aizen, he sounded dangerous beyond even the might of Soul Society if his mechanization extended as far back as they appeared. Ichigo nodded, pushing aside the thoughts for later contemplation. He questioned, "So how does it work with you guys?" Something seemed to settle in the air at the question, something that had been tense, like someone waiting on the edge of a seat. Shinji and Kisuke traded a meaning-filled glance even as Lisa stated, "Our Zanpakuto spirits were hollowified. They became uncontrollable, able to take over our bodies. We became locked in a fight for dominance. It is through Kisuke's intervention that we were given the time to learn how to suppress our spirits. We are able to draw on that power and use the masks you've seen along with other technique." The answer was clinical, technical, like something read from a textbook. Lisa, for all the cold exterior, didn't speak like that normally. There was something apathetic to her gaze, like if she spoke about it any other way it would be too real. Ichigo didn't like what he was hearing. Suppressing their Zanpakuto spirit? How could one cut out half their soul, bar the door on communication, and not go crazy? If Ichigo had learned anything through Zangetsu and Benihime, it was that your soul, your Zanpakuto, no matter how it reflected it, was a part of you. It was you in a sense. Zangetsu shifted at Ichigo's back, and Ichigo knew his spirit felt the same. Suddenly, Ichigo couldn't accept that, leaving his family to be cut off from half their soul, their drive for revenge clear now that Ichigo understood the purpose. Ichigo glanced up from the mug in his hands, noticed the anxious glances and stated, "I think you're going about it all wrong. Zangetsu is like your spirits and we get along perfectly well. Your spirits are all trapped, immobilized, or hardly cognizant. That's not right." They stared at Ichigo, really stared at him in a drowning silence that he was beginning to tire of. After a moment, Shinji tipped his head back and began laughing. The sound was light at first glance, but there was something else beneath it all, something like a sob. Love shook his head and stared at Ichigo. Mashiro was grinning as if she had been right all along, and Rose was staring at his hands with something like guilt in his eyes. Hachi was studying Ichigo with something like awe, and Kisuke and Yoruichi were staring at him with wide eyes. "Only you, Ichigo," Shinji announced as he regained his breath, shaking his head and staring at the kid curled up on the couch. The kid who was smarter than them all, probably, the kid whose answer was so simple in words yet complicated beyond measure, in reality, the kid with a spirit like theirs, and he knew it, and they all wondered now what the kid thought of them, of their spirits. Kenshi stood, drawing the attention of the group. He walked over to Ichigo and kneeled down, so they could look each other in the eyes. The Visored, who held a stoic exterior like a coat of armor but was a softie on the inside, reached out and ruffled Ichigo's hair before asking, "Do you think you could help us fix things then, Ichigo?" The Visored stared at Ichigo. He could see Kisuke and Yoruichi studying him, could almost feel the pause in the air. He could almost see the faint shadows of their spirits. They were his family as much as Yuzu and Karen. They were training him, and he would return the favor. Ichigo nodded with a bright smile. X. Aizen stared at the monitor in front of him with a frown. Kaname stood behind him with something pleased to his Reiatsu. The Shinigami thought he had been the first to notice the irregularity in the video footage. Sasuke had noticed it over a year before but had chosen to wait and see how the situation developed. Ichigo Kurosaki, the outcome of his experimental hollow, Isshin Shiba, and Mosoki Kurosaki. The child had potential for his bloodline alone. He would grow to challenge Aizen in power and likely ability, something worth noting in the isolation his powers imposed. But the child was growing beyond his expectations and the plans outlined. The pawns were moving on their own accord. Aizen wasn't certain if the fact was irritating or intriguing for the potential it provided. Mosoki Kurosaki had died as planned, but Kisuke, the thrice-damned meddler, had taken a material position in Ichigo's life. Aizen understood how the scientist's mind worked, had known he would prefer to remain unattached to Ichigo while his plans bore fruition. But Kisuke had interfered, had gotten close to the child and was training him in the Shinigami arts. It was also likely, from the footage the insects had gathered of the child walking towards the industrial district, where footage shorted out due to the Kido barriers, that he was training with the Visored. There was also the footage Kaname was so proud of finding. Aizen had noticed the child speaking to the air, speaking to nothing even when the insects were able to observe the spiritual plane within the mortal world. At first, Aizen had estimated it was an imaginary friend. They were common for young children, even those who saw spirits. But then, Ichigo had materialized a sealed Zanpakuto and its name when he fought against a hollow. Aizen was certain now that the child was, in fact, seeing Zanpakuto spirits. There were little other reasonable deductions. The prospect was interesting, and it left Sasuke to wonder how the child's growth would be affected. Staring at the screen, Aizen watched as Ichigo Kurosaki spoke to thin air and planned. X. Ichigo tucked the groceries in his hands under one arm as he opened the door. He ducked automatically under his father's outstretched foot, letting the overgrown manchild fly out onto the street. Closing the door behind him, Ichigo shook his head and entered their home. It was different to how it had been when his mom had been alive. There had been more of a feminine touch, something a bit warmer too. But it was still their home regardless. Yuzu and Karen were seated at the dining room table, an empty plate and 2 mugs between the two, along with everything one could need to complete homework, which was to say a mountain of paper. Karen was slumped forward, her head planted on the table as if that would allow her to absorb the information on the sheets. Yuzu was dutifully filling it out with a determined look she had taken straight from Ichigo. It was math homework, he decided. Nothing else could put an expression like that on a 7-year-old's face. Yuzu was the first to notice Ichigo as he shuffled towards the kitchen, keeping a wary eye on the floor to see if their father had attempted to cook. Again. Their dad was good at making 3 recipes, and that was his repertoire. Anything else tended to blow up, like Ichigo's attempts at Kido. Ichini! Yuzu chirped, slipping from the table to run over and wrap her skinny arms around him. Ichigo grinned at his younger sister but couldn't ruffle her hair like he wanted to due to his occupied hands. Pulling back, Yuzu noticed the groceries in his hands and her eyes brightened. She had given him strict instructions that morning to buy ingredients for both onigiri and mochi so that Yuzu could try their mom's recipe. "Hi, Ichigo." Karen greeted with a wave where she had lifted her head up from the table. Ichigo grinned at Karen and replied, "I'll come to help you with your homework. Let me just get dinner started, okay?" The dark-haired twin brightened at his words and nodded with a wide grin that was far more predatory than it needed to be. And maybe having Tatsuki tutor Karen in martial arts, particularly judo, wasn't the best idea. At least Yuzu had chosen Taikai. Ichigo looked down when he felt a tug on his shirt and followed Yuzu into the kitchen. "How was training today?" Yuzu asked as together they worked to put the small bag of groceries away, pulling out the stool to reach the higher shelves, and debating whether to put the rice on the lower shelf for the future or to follow tradition. Nodding as Ichigo pulled out the rice cooker and put a pot of water on the stove, he responded, "It was good. Kisuke showed me a new move to use when one of the local Yakuza tried to use a knife on me." Karen's head peeked over the window at that statement with keen intrigue. Ichigo could tell his sister would become a vicious power on the streets in her own right. Yuzu didn't gasp. She had long demanded the truth and gotten used to it. Instead, she replied, "Just be careful, itchy knee." "Always," Ichigo responded honestly as he chopped the pork before. With a tilt of his head he asked the twins, "How was school?" Karen groaned at the question as if the mere thought of school was torture, while Yuzu shrugged as she passed Ichigo the chopped vegetables. Ichigo took the plate and added it to the pot, checking on the rice. Suddenly, Yuzu brightened as if remembering something and added, "On the way home from school Karen saw a ghost." "Really? Where?" Ichigo asked curiously, part of him screaming in warning to consume the soul as soon as possible so it wouldn't attract hollows, a redundant point considering his Reiatsu. Karen and Yuzu shared a glance that he pretended not to notice, as any brother should when it came to twins, and returned his attention to the simmering pot. "Near the school," Yuzu replied as she hopped up onto the stool beside Ichigo to peer at the pot. Ichigo handed the spoon to her and guided her arm in the correct movement like his mom had shown him. Smiling at the twins he suggested, "How about we walk home from school together tomorrow and you can show me where?" Karen made a face at Ichigo, but Yuzu nodded in that endearing way of hers that made Ichigo recall tiny little hands grasping his own. Nodding to himself, Ichigo studied the pot and decided that the kitchen would survive if he sat at the dining table and helped the twins with their homework. With a mischievous grin, Ichigo attacked and picked Yuzu up, tucking her over his shoulder and accompanying the motion with an evil laugh. Yuzu's fists battered weakly against his shoulder as Ichigo marched over to the table, struggling only a tiny bit with her weight as Karen followed behind and demanded he put her down. With a chuckle, Ichigo plopped Yuzu on her seat at the table. She giggled even as Karen with a huff slunk to her seat. It made Ichigo happy to see his sisters like this. After their mom had died, it had felt like the life had been sucked out of their home, like everyone had just been going through the motion. That had changed now. Yuzu smiled, and though Karen had adopted a tough exterior, she was just as happy as Yuzu. "Now why don't you show me what's giving you trouble?" Ichigo stated as he slid into a chair beside his sisters, peering at the sheets of paper with his own curling sense of dread. Ichigo was smart. Benihime would accept nothing less, but regardless, homework was homework and he still had his own to do. Together they went over the equations. Ichigo explained it patiently and tried to teach it to the twins in a way that they might understand better than the teacher's explanation. "Ichigo?" Karen questioned as the twins worked on the problems on their own, and Ichigo took a moment to breathe, feeling Zangetsu's presence around him as the spirit rested his elbows on Ichigo's shoulders, an intangible weight. Ichigo nodded and Karen's eyes flickered up, as if to Zangetsu, before she added, "Lately, I've been seeing some things that aren't spirits." "Yuzu's seen it occasionally too." Ichigo paused at the information, surprise making its way across his features for a moment. Dumbly he responded, "Oh." Yuzu and Karen traded another glance and Ichigo shook himself from the shock, and with a nod at Zangetsu Ichigo turned to the twins and with seriousness pulling at his features he explained, "I think what you are seeing is the same as what I'm seeing. You know how Shinigami have Zanpakuto spirits?" Ichigo questioned, and when the girls nodded he continued, "Well, what you're seeing is my Zanpakuto spirit, I think. His name is Zangetsu. You might also be seeing Uncle Kisuke's spirit, her name is Benihime. They can't touch you, but they can talk to you. But you can't tell anyone, okay? You know your spirit, Ichigo?" Karen questioned, something pensive in her eyes as she stared at the space behind Ichigo. Yuzu was also staring with a light frown curling her lips as Ichigo nodded once. At that moment, the door to their home slammed open and their dad appeared. He took one look at the three of them together at the dinner table and began to wail to the poster of Mom about family values. Ichigo rolled his eyes and entered the kitchen to escape his father, but first, he flashed a wink at the twins. As he checked on the food, Ichigo could hear Karen attempt to berate their father for sobbing at the portrait of their mom, even as Yuzu tried to make peace of their situation. They were his family and he would protect them no matter what. Ichigo rolled onto his feet, Zangetsu snapping up in front of him as another Zanpakuto collided with his in a screech of sparks. Ichigo moved quickly. He wasn't strong enough against an adult to try and hold out. He disappeared in a burst of Shinpa and appeared behind his opponent. The Visored whipped around. Her Zanpakuto was still sealed, but the mask on her features was harsh against the light of the underground training area. Ichigo's eye strayed for a moment as he paused light on his feet. An alert! Lisa's spirit hovered behind her, the gossamer wings that normally cocooned the spirit were humming and whipping through the air, sharp and deadly like glass. Zangetsu's hand guided his own as the blade snapped up to intercept Lisa's. They engaged in a flurry of movement, something like a dance, but far too vicious. As Zangetsu helped guide Ichigo's movements, he observed the Zanpakuto spirit opposite him. It fluttered and twitched angrily, and its mouth opened as if in a silent scream as its wielder fought with the mask on her features. There was something agitated about the spirit, even more so than the tension when the mask wasn't worn. Ichigo could also see, as he ducked under an overhead swing using his height to his advantage, that the spirit was attempting to contact Lisa, yelling her name over and over again. She was also trying to claw her. It made the frown of concentration on Ichigo's features deepen. This was the first time since the hollow attack that they were going to try some healing, that they were going to try and use Ichigo's powers. There had been a training session in between where everyone had acted as if nothing had happened even though the air had been awkward and full of long uncommunicated looks. But they were willing to try now, it just had to set in, was the excuse they had used. He could feel Shinji and Hachi waiting a short distance away, partially to observe Ichigo's technique and partially for his safety. So, that if something with the spirit or Lisa happened they could step in. They had fought on it, allowing Ichigo to fight the Visored while they used their masks. But Ichigo needed to see their spirits and how they acted when their masks were donned. Feeling a light tug on the back of his t-shirt, Ichigo pulled back just in time to watch Lisa's Zanpakuto cut through the space his chest had been. There was something about the movement that was unsteady. Lisa was always controlled, like ice, and just as unyielding. Lisa flew forward using Shuimpa and Ichigo caught her blade on his own as he studied the mask in front of him. Only Mashiro was able to use any of the hollow techniques Kisuke had told him about, and it wasn't just because she worked hard. Mashiro's connection to her spirit was different from the rest, it didn't feel parasitic like the others, it was like it was supposed to be symbiotic. Ichigo knew with a certainty that burned through his thoughts that if the Visored could re-establish or even strengthen the bond with their Zanpakuto spirits, they would be powerful beyond even the boost the transformation had originally provided. And if they learned how to use Garganta, Sonido, Sero? Well, Ichigo vindictively supposed Aizen would have a lot more to be afraid of. Ichigo gasped as Lisa landed a roundhouse kick on his solar plexus, all the air whooshing out of his lungs in a way that made his eyes sting. Ichigo turned the fall into a roll and rose to his feet with his hands raised in surrender. Lisa's blade hovered in front of his neck and with a loud crack her mask split apart and turned into dust. Something in Ichigo's chest that had been tight was a bit loose again. Clapping echoed in the overarching space of the underground training area and Ichigo groaned and shook his head. Lisa dropped her sword and rolled her eyes at Shinji as he stalked towards them, every movement that of a predator. They all walked like soldiers, dangerous. That was a good fight, Ichigo, Lisa. Shinji commented with a piano grin, his eye sweeping over the two of them with something possessive. Lisa nodded once at the compliment and strode off towards Hachi. Shinji didn't react to Lisa's blunt mannerisms and turned his attention on Ichigo. So, did you learn anything of interest, Ichi? Shinji questioned, something heartbreakingly hopeful in his voice as he stared down at Ichigo with bright eyes. Zangetsu's presence hovered behind Ichigo as he sealed his blade away. After a moment, Ichigo nodded. He was still trying to figure out how he was supposed to help the Visored. Ichigo was 8, almost 9, how was he supposed to be able to plan a therapy session? Benihime and Zangetsu were helping, they had suggestions and words of wisdom, and even Osen had pitched in. But Ichigo felt the weight of it on his shoulders. If he couldn't help the Visored, their souls would be left to suffer, and if he failed when helping them, there was the chance he could make it worse. But Ichigo couldn't let his hesitation stop him, he had to try. Shinji grinned and ruffled Ichigo's hair before landing a guiding hand on his shoulder and moving Ichigo forward towards the ladder. Shinji glanced at Ichigo for a moment before he looked up and stated, "We're gonna head upstairs now and YA can take a break in the living room. If YA wanna discuss what YA saw." "YA don't have tar though, Ichi. We ain't pushing this on YA, we're more than grateful that YA helping us, okay? YA don't owe us any time, all right?" Ichigo stared at Shinji, who had stopped in front of the ladder, his words resounding around them. It was just the two of them and their spirits. He could see Sakand now wrapped around her owner, bandages floating ethereally upside down. Ichigo nodded and moved forward to stand beside Shinji for a moment. The blonde grinned down at Ichigo and elbowed his way forward to the ladder. Ichigo laughed and ducked under Shinji's arms and clambered up the ladder first. X. Ichigo and Shinji entered the living room with laughter on their breaths. Shinji was ruffling the kid's hair and Ichigo was swatting at him with a grin. Rose squished beside Love as they pored over the music sheets their editor had returned, glanced up and watched the child. Ichigo was interesting. Things did not add up around him. It was like the sudden flip from a minor key to a major one, dissonant at best. Rose, and by extent Love, both knew that if Ichigo wasn't so young, didn't hold on to that childish naivety even in the face of everything, that they wouldn't trust him. It was still baffling that they did, Rose supposed. The betrayal of one of their comrades was still fresh, still lingered like a raw open wound, beginning to fester like an infection. They had formed a close-knit group whose outside contact had been limited to Kisuke's entourage and faceless mortals who they could never become close to. They all didn't want to contemplate how jaded that made them. Interacting with a child was different. It felt like they were all walking on eggshells, even if the kid now knew about their hollow nature. Ichigo was still a kid. He didn't understand the blood and brutality Soul Society was so good at hiding. But then again, Rose supposed that was why Kisuke had begun training Ichigo. Soul Society was bound to notice his powers sooner rather than later, and it was far better to be prepared than to send a child in blind. It all worried them that Aizen's eyes were also set on the child. Shinji steered Ichigo to an open seat, studying the gathered Visored with eyes of warning. Their leader was protective of Ichigo. At heart they all were. Still, Love's fingers crossed over Rose's as they studied the sheets on the table in silent communication. Rose hummed an assent even as he scowled at one of the notations their editor had included. That part was clearly a crescendo, not a diminuendo. Glancing up from the sheets as Shinji curled into the armchair that was conveniently placed where they all could see it, Rose glimpsed Hachi and Lisa talking in the kitchen. Hiyuri was likely lying in wait for an ambush, which she had gleefully taken to springing on Ichigo. Kenshi and Mashiro were seated together on the couch poring over a magazine. Well, it was more Mashiro talking and Kenshi responding every so often with a noncommittal noise. How was training, Ichigo? Love questioned, tilting his glasses so he could see Ichigo curled up on the other armchair better. Rose's eyes flickered first to Love, who liked Ichigo for his spunk, and then to the child in question. Ichigo grinned all bright enthusiasm and replied, "It was really great. When Lisa uses her mask, all of her attack power increases exponentially." Exponentially? Where'd YA learn a word like that? Shinji leered at the kid even as the unspoken question about what they all really wanted to know but weren't going to push for hung on the air. Ichigo stuck his tongue out at Shinji and replied with a huff and a secretive grin, "Benihime taught me it. She uses ginormous words when we talk because she's dignified." Rose's lips curled slightly at the answer because it was endearing to listen to an 8-year-old say words like ginormous, and Rose wasn't such a fool as to deny that. Love chuckled under his breath as an unsubtle elbow jostled his side. Rolling his eyes, Rose traded a quick glance with Love before returning his attention to the conversation at hand. Shinji was cawing with laughter, cackling in that way that set him up as the perfect movie villain with ease. Ichigo was staring at the blonde with a raised brow as if he expected better of their immature leader. "Any Ichigo?" Mashiro interrupted, the magazine in her hands forgotten as she stared at Ichigo with all the bright enamored look of a puppy. Ichigo tilted his head in response and Mashiro smiled and asked, "Can you see my spirit?" Rose stared at Mashiro for a minute, a long one, and Love was right there with him. There had been an unofficial rule that they weren't going to bring it up unless Ichigo himself brought it up. No matter how curious or desperate they were, Rose could hear the dissonance like too many notes strung together, like an out-of-tune piano. They had even given Kenshi the explicit job of clearing that up with Mashiro. And yet here they were. Ichigo's eyes darted to the left of Mashiro's head and he nodded once before he squished his features together in thought and added, "I can see her, she's very fast though, and I can sort of hear her voice. I can't hear anyone else's though." You can't hear our spirits' voices? Rose questioned curiously and intrigued, wondering at how Ichigo's powers functioned. They certainly didn't fit into anything anyone had seen before. As Love's low chuckles filled the air, Rose realized he had jumped on the bandwagon of talking about Ichigo's ability and their own spirits. Yeah, they're all silent. When I was fighting Lisa today, I could see her spirit's mouth open, but no words came out that I could hear. I think it's because the bond is so damaged. It's like how I couldn't meet Zangetsu till I was ready to meet him. Or how some Shinigami don't hear their spirit's name till they're ready. Something somber filled the air at the statement, at the mention of their bonds, or lack thereof, with their Zanpakuto spirits. Rose could see Lisa hovering in the doorway to the kitchen. There was something glacial to her features, but the ice was transparent for all of its structure. Rose could feel the same emotions in his own chest, the same way he saw them reflected in Love's eyes. It was the thing they didn't talk about for all their shared kinship. It's not like we can talk to them either, Lisa added with bitterness as she entered the living room, Hachi following slowly behind her with something pensive on the large man's features. Ichigo screwed up his face again in an easy tell that was admittedly somewhat cute and asked, "Well, why not?" "It's not that simple, Ichi. Every time we enter our inner worlds, they try to fight us, and they're screaming or they're dead silent. There's no time for a heart-to-heart in that environment. We're constantly fighting to stay in control." Shinji responded with fake cheeriness, something brittle beneath the words. Rose glanced away from Ichigo and stared at his own hands, ones that had once wielded his Zanpakuto with confidence. Their bond had been strong, a perfect harmony that Rose could always hear faintly in the background. And when they fought together, they had been unstoppable. Aizen had taken that from them. Now there was always uncertainty, a fear of feeling too much for what it might unleash. When Rose fought, he was able to use his Zanpakuto, but it had become a tool, not a partner. Perhaps not even a tool. It hurt, like the thorns on a rose, except there was no beauty on the surface, only their separation. Rose shuddered a breath and cleared his head, blinked away the pain burning his eyes. Love's hand, larger than his own, covered Rose's, and the man's Reiatsu hummed in reassurance, even as Rose knew his partner's thoughts were likely the same. But they had a chance now. There was a hope rekindling that it could become better. If that hope rested on the shoulders of a child? Well, it was all they had. That's what I was talking about last time. You can't fight your Zanpakuto spirits, they're a part of you. It doesn't matter if they're the darkest parts of you, they're still you. So, fighting them doesn't make sense. Zangetsu has gold eyes and is a bit hollow-like, but he hasn't tried to assert his dominance or whatever, Ichigo said in the empty silence of the living room that felt as if it had been filled with old ghosts. Everyone looked up at Ichigo's words, and Rose tried to process the many layers compacted into 4 sentences. It wasn't as simple as Ichigo made it. Was it? They had tried to talk to their spirits for years, nothing worked, and then they were forced to fight for their lives. There was no time to find balance again. They had tried. Then there was the bit about Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit. Gold eyes? Hollow-like nature? They all had heard Kisuke's story, because the man liked to talk about how Mosoki and Isshin had met. So, they had known there had been a likelihood of their child having a hollow nature. But if Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit was already part hollow, then that changed things. It's not that simple, we're fighting for our lives. Kenshi protested even as Love cut in. Hold up, what does your spirit look like, Ichigo? I think it is quite different for you, Ichigo, as you grew up with your spirit. This happened to us suddenly, Hachi added, throwing another line of conversation into the mess forming in the living room. Ichigo was frowning, a look of consternation on his features as his eyes flickered to them and to random spaces near them. Conversation erupted like a volcano, spewing words everywhere. Shinji took one look at the still chaotic situation and called out, "One at a time, y'all. Ichigo isn't heading home till 6, so we got time to converse and sort it out. Besides, he'll be back next week." Everyone settled in their seats, and Rose could feel Love's curiosity even as the larger man bumped his shoulder with Rose's. At that moment, Hiyuri appeared flying through the air with an outstretched foot and a battle cry. Ichigo tilted to the side and let the small blonde crash into the opposite wall. That started the chaos once more as Shinji yelled at Hiyuri, and Hiyuri yelled back like two screeching cats. Rose sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose before returning his attention to the sheets on the table. Order would reinstate itself soon enough, and in any case, it was as Shinji said, Ichigo wasn't leaving for a little while and there was always the next session. Though a few minutes later, Rose only had to look once at Lisa frowning before she stood up and yelled, "Enough," and returned to her manga. "I think I've figured it out a bit," Ichigo stated after a few minutes, and just like that silence filled the room, pregnant and looming, waiting on a hair's breadth. The kid rubbed a hand on the back of his head and began, "The thing is, a hollow is all about instinct. They don't think of the world in shades of grey, just their hunger. Now I doubt you all feel the need to begin eating souls." A few awkward chuckles followed the joke before Ichigo began again. "But trying to talk to them won't work. And I don't think winning in battle will either. Because then you're telling your spirit that you're dominant, that you rule and control them. It isn't a partnership. And you're challenging them to keep trying, to wait for a moment of weakness so they can unseat you. So, I think you guys need to accept it. Accept that you have a hollow nature, that you aren't fully Shinigami anymore. I think? I don't know how you can accomplish that because each soul is different, each spirit and person is different. But I think once you make that first step, you open the line of communication. There will still be hurt. You ignored or shut away your other half for over 50 years. But I think that's where I come in." Ichigo finished staring at all of them with eyes that burned, searing its way right into their soul and forced them to see, to understand. Rose released his grip on the now crinkled sheet in his hand and let out a breath he wasn't aware he had been holding. All around him the other Visored sat in shocked silence, staring at this kid who had figured it out when centuries-old adults hadn't been able to. Silence lingered heavy with thought, and Ichigo sat in the middle of it, receiving the occasional astonished or thoughtful gazes. "And Ichigo?" He talked to his Zanpakuto spirit in a quiet whisper, letting everyone stew and simmer. Love shifted, and Rose almost sighed in relief, because Love was good at breaking anyone out of a funk, anyone but himself, that is. But that was what Rose was there for. "Yo, Ichigo, you never did elaborate on your spirit," Love said to the silence of the room, gathering everyone's attention. Ichigo tilted his head for a moment, his eyes flickering upwards, probably towards Zangetsu, and wasn't that an interesting name, and back towards them. "Well, it's like I said. Zangetsu has yellow eyes like a hollow, and he runs on instinct too, but he's sort of a bit more blended, I guess. Because Zangetsu isn't bone white like a hollow, and he doesn't dress in white either. But he also doesn't wear black, and he's not perfectly like a Zanpakuto spirit. It would be cool if I could materialize him to show you guys, but that's impossible, I think." Ichigo rambled, like a kid talking about their favorite superhero. To be fair, Rose supposed that the child spirit was likely close to a brother figure to Ichigo, especially considering what he knew of Isshin Shiba's parenting skills. He had never personally known the man while in Soul Society, but the Shiba's reputation preceded them well enough. Even if Ichigo had more of his mother in him. "Ichigo, have I told why this before? You're one weird kid," Shinji stated dramatically with a laugh, and liked that the remaining tenseness evaporated. Rose knew they would all be thinking of this conversation in the next few days, that they would try to make contact with their spirits. He could only wonder. Ichigo pouted at Shinji and shook his head even as Mashiro nodded fervently in agreement. Ichigo turned betrayed eyes on the woman who bounced over and ruffled his hair. Lisa adjusted the glasses on her nose even as she smiled, and Love's booming laughter echoed inside Rose's chest as he stared at his family, and at the center of it Ichigo. Benihime materialized across from Ichigo, where Kisuke had been sitting, in a graceful whisper of pale smoke. Her smoldering eyes above the lip of the fan were trained on Ichigo with a gaze that felt predatory by nature. Ichigo, who was still a touch out of breath from the training session with Kisuke, inclined his head in a low bow of respect to the Zanpakuto spirit. The painted fan in Benihime's hand snapped shut, and Ichigo glimpsed the curve of a smile. Tessa's spirit phased through the wall. He glanced once at Ichigo as if to be assured of his safety before continuing. Tessa's spirit was solemn and quiet, not in a forced manner like the Visored, but in a reflection of the deep nature of Tessai's soul. Yoruichi, on the other hand, had a spirit that was playful in the same way a cat played with a mouse. Taking a sip of the tea Kisuke had brought before he had darted from the room with an insistent beeping accompanying his hurried motions, Ichigo stared at Benihime. The Zanpakuto spirit studied Ichigo in kind for a few moments before she opened her lips and spoke. You are making progress in your fights against Kisuke. Do not be disheartened by your failure, impudent brat. Ichigo hid his expression by tucking his head to his chest, a smile appearing at the nickname spoken with fondness in a voice like unsheathed steel. When Ichigo had regained control of his emotions, because Benihime wore her own emotions like a mask and expected the same as her disciple, he intoned softly, "Thank you, Benihime." The elegant spirit huffed, but the motion was belied by her amusement. Ichigo took another sip of his tea and recalled the multiple lessons Benihime had attempted to drill into his skull: how to be observant of his surroundings, manipulate the feelings and motives of others, and Ichigo supposed above all, how to survive in the climate the denizens of the Gotei 13 thrived in. Ichigo didn't know how to take some of the lessons to heart, much less to understand them, but Benihime believed he was a lifetime investment, so there was no getting out of them even if he desired such. Don't make that expression when you think Ichigo, it is an obvious tell. Besides, in battle, you will not have the time to plan and contemplate your opponent's life story. And all things in life are a battle, so you cannot let the world know that you're disobeying logic regardless. Benihime stated in that cutting tone, the words like a riddle that Ichigo had to unravel for a few moments before he nodded in understanding. At least Zangetsu didn't speak in riddles, he didn't lie. Oh, the spirit would avoid the truth if possible, and he could be sly, but he had never lied to Ichigo. The spirit shook her head, the long tresses of ebony hair flowing with the movement like the ripple of silk. She was probably thinking he was a hopeless case again. The woman studied Ichigo, her eyes peering beneath the material as if she could see all the threads that made up his soul, tying him to Kisuke, the Visored, his family, his powers. Finally, Benihime sighed and stated, "Be careful, Ichigo. You've done well in limiting the effect of your Reiatsu on those around you. But in the end, peace does not come kindly to you." With those final cryptic parting words, the spirit dematerialized in a collection of smoke that left the faint scent of jasmine in the air. A low chuckle sounded next to Ishigo's ear as Zangetsu appeared, his larger form curled around Ichigo as if to protect him from the outside world. "She sure is prim and haughty. Exactly like the nobles of Soul Society." The spirit said the words, rasping about the air with little venom. For all the appearance of animosity between the two, Benihime and Zangetsu actually got along well. Ichigo was sure it was their shared penchant for bloodlust. He wondered what his spirit meant about the nobles of Soul Society. Kisuke had briefly explained the hierarchy of how the afterlife worked, but Soul Society was a topic the man spoke little of in depth. Then again, Ichigo suspected there were a lot of things he wasn't given the detail for. With a creak of unoiled hinges, because that wasn't something Shinigami apparently understood, Kisuke entered the room. There was a cloud of smoke hovering about him, his face was a bit singed and smudged, but overall the scientist looked fine. Kisuke smiled when he saw Ichigo and shuffled over to settle carefully opposite him at the table. Zangetsu scoffed at the man's appearance but remained curled around Ichigo, a constant source of warmth. "Not too bored?" Kisuke questioned as he busied himself in fixing a cup of tea with copious amounts of sugar and something in a vial he produced from his sleeve. Ichigo nodded and replied, "Benihime and I talked." "What happened?" Kisuke blushed, which meant the explosion was an accident and that Yoruichi would probably yell at him about it later. With a bit of a shrug, the man replied, "I've been working on an invention to destroy a powerful and dangerous object. But nothing I have tried has worked. I have a few ideas, but at the moment it is safe for now." "Safe from Aizen?" Ichigo questioned with a tilt of his head even as he wondered what the powerful object could be. It was likely that if it was as powerful as Kisuke had described, because the man hardly held his punches, that is had been used before, or it had a specific design purpose. Kisuke scowled and shook his head, tilting the brim of his hat over his eyes to shade them from view. He commented wryly, "You really are too smart, Ichigo. I'm going to have to tell Benihime to stop teaching you before your father cries that I've corrupted you. Personally, I think Mom would be really proud of me." And you're avoiding the subject, Kisuke. Ichigo responded, the words coming out easily even as he mentally reviewed them. Would his mom be proud of who he was? All she had wanted for him in life, like any mother, was for Ichigo to be happy. And he was happy. The ability to protect those around him, no matter what skills he utilized, provided him with purpose, with a way to keep moving forward. Kisuke sighed and scrubbed a hand over his features before tangling it in his hair. The man replied, yes. I suppose I shouldn't be telling you this now, you're 9 for Kami's sake. But in the end ignorance is dangerous, and you would probably pry the information out of Benihime or one of the Visored eventually. The Hueco is a stone I created while I was captain of the 12th Division, the Research Division, while I was in Soul Society. It was a project of mine. I wanted to see if we could surpass the barrier between Hollow and Shinigami. How that could even work was purely theoretical at the time. I have the feeling that the stone wanted to be created, for a nefarious purpose, I can't say. But it soon came into existence. I can't say when Aizen turned traitor. Maybe he had been like that from the beginning, maybe a vendetta he carried for a past crime. His past is as murky as most of Soul Society. He did well in the academy, nothing on the level of some of the prodigies we've seen before, but he was talented. He appeared kind and bland, I suppose that should have flagged some warning, but regardless he quickly moved through the ranks. You know Shinji, he's a suspicious paranoid bastard at heart. He never trusted Aizen, and so following the ancient proverb he made the man his lieutenant. I'm not sure when exactly Aizen learned of the Hueco, but he attempted to create his own, and he succeeded in part. He used the Hueco to experiment on the souls of Rungakai, turning some into hollows, and taking parts of other souls to fuel his Hueco. The Visored were one of his experiments and one of his plots to damage and diminish the strength of Soul Society. He has 2 Shinigami working with him who turned traitor. Kanaim Chusen, blind and with a sense of justice that would make anyone else wince, and Jin Ichimaru, a fox-faced man whose motives are always questionable. Anyways, back to the point, Aizen wants to combine the 2 Hueco, his and mine, so that he could create powerful Espada, and as I suspect wage war on Soul Society. At the moment, he still is trusted in Soul Society, so we have to bide our time and protect it the best we can. Kisuke finished with an exhale of breath before he tipped back the tea in his hands, chugging the still hot contents. Ichigo winced even as he tried to process the boatload of information his uncle had delivered. It was all because of one man. The thought scared Ichigo in a distant sort of way because he knew, some way or another he would be involved in Soul Society's affairs. He was working with the Visored and he was Kisuke's godson, there was little doubt. Zangetsu's warmth wrapped around Ichigo, settling the racing thoughts and forcing him to take a breath and calm down, analyze the information as Benihime would. After a minute, where the silence allowed him to process it, Ichigo glanced at Kisuke, who was staring at him with shaded eyes and something somber. I didn't want to involve you, Ichigo. You shouldn't have to handle Aizen, the weight of such should be forced onto the spines of the captains of Soul Society. But I doubt that will pass so easily. Even my own plans fall apart sometimes. Kisuke said, the silhouette of Benihime curled around the Shinigami. Ichigo nodded in acceptance. He knew that. He understood that if Aizen was successful in destroying the Gotei 13, then the balance of the mortal world would cease to exist, and his family would be in danger. Ichigo didn't want to fight, and a part of him hoped that nothing occurred for another 20 years, even if it delayed the vengeance of those he was close to. But Ichigo couldn't control fate. Enough of this depressing topic of conversation. Why don't I explain to you in depth how the Gotei 13's different divisions are oriented? Kisuke suggested, something desperate in his tone. Ichigo studied his mentor for a moment, studied the hidden words telling Ichigo that Kisuke would do his best to prepare Ichigo for the future so that he wouldn't walk in blind, and nodded. X. Kisuke's head jerked up from his desk as a dull ringing sound penetrated the state of bleary exhaustion the scientist had been immersed in after spending what many would consider too many hours awake. The part of him that was awake acknowledged that the sound was not blaring in warning, those were generally louder for instances such as this. With a bit of lightbulb moment, Kisuke recalled that he did indeed have a cell phone, on a certain man's insistence, and that it was at his desk. Lifting his head off of said desk, Kisuke peered through a mop of blonde hair and searched through the endless papers crowding his desk in something of a hurry as the ringing continued. After a moment, Kisuke made a triumphant noise and plucked up the mortal device, flipped it open, spared a minute to squint at the call identification. Why would Isshin be calling him at 5 in the morning, and answered the call. Oh, thank Kami, seriously Kisuke, I was about to end the call and try again. Isshin's gravelly voice sounded over the telephone and Kisuke quirked a brow, wondering at his friend's motives. Scrubbing a hand over his features, Kisuke adjusted the phone and responded, hello to you as well, Isshin. What is this all about? There was a sigh on the other end of the line followed by an inhale, then Isshin's voice came through, Is Ichigo sleeping over at the Shiten tonight? Worry was evident in the father's voice, and for a moment stone-cold dread dropped into the pit of his stomach as Kisuke frowned and said, no. Are you sure he isn't home? No, he was there this evening, and I checked on him before I went to bed. There's no sign of struggle, nothing missing, it's like his bed wasn't even touched. Isshin said something, panic making its way into his voice accompanying the sense of dread that was creeping closer. Kisuke grimaced, but didn't say anything as silence lingered on the line. You think he took him, don't you? Isshin half accused, half asked, his tone gone cold and scared. Kisuke curled his hands into a fist. Some part of his mind was saying it wasn't real, wasn't possible. Another part, the one that thought like Aizen, knew it was more than likely. I'll be over in 10 minutes. X. Ichigo blinked and stared at the two white ceiling above him. The white was almost unnatural, it reminded him of a Visored mask or the way his mom's skin had looked in the rain that night. Ichigo blinked and stared as he tried to recall where he was because his ceiling had never been this white, and it was missing the dent from the time his dad had collided with the ceiling after a sneak attack gone wrong. He didn't understand why his dad had started doing that. Inhaling softly, Ichigo pushed aside his internal panic and tried to rationalize. Maybe they were at a hotel? His uncle's house, the one they never talked to. Or Kisuke had shoved him into a room in the Shiten. Pulling slightly on his Reiatsu, Ichigo reached for Zangetsu's presence. The spirit materialized by Ichigo's feet, just in the corner of his vision, the pale grey cloth draped around his shoulders stark against the white of the walls. Zangetsu was frowning, or rather the expression was more akin to a feral animal baring its teeth. The expression burned in Ichigo's chest, sparking the dull embers of panic into a full blaze. Because if his spirit was sporting that expression, then something was wrong. Ichigo resisted the urge to surge forward and explore his surroundings. He needed to remain still and take stock of the situation. There could be cameras, someone watching him, people behind a one-way mirror, anything. Inhaling and exhaling slowly as if breathing in sleep, Ichigo calmed the panic that was surging through his veins and tried to think of what Benihime might say in the situation he was in. She would probably go and search their surroundings because as far as they knew, only Ichigo could see her. He couldn't do that himself, but Zangetsu could. The spirit drifted forward, listening to his silent thoughts so that Ichigo could see familiar features curled in a blazing frown even as Zangetsu nodded his assent and whispered, "Be cautious, Ichigo. There are multiple powerful beings here. I'll return quickly." A warm hand drifted through Ichigo's hair for a moment before Zangetsu dematerialized, fading away and leaving the silence of the room, all-encompassing and drowning. Ichigo closed his eyes and ignored the way his eyes burned. He needed to find out where he was and who had kidnapped him. It had to be someone with a reason. Everyone had a reason. He was specifically chosen, taken from his home in a professional manner, nothing clumsy like chloroform in an alleyway. There were a few options that Ichigo knew were possible and others that could be plausible depending on the situation. At the forefront of his mind were Aizen or Soul Society. Soul Society was a possibility for the sole fact that, from the history Kisuke had written and forced him to read as homework, Ichigo had identified a continuous pattern where the Gotei 13 did not like those who were different and powerful. Not to mention there was the possibility of the research division discovering his existence, or the Onmitsuke discovering his father. Both were unlikely. Kisuke was careful and paranoid to a fault. The other very likely possibility was Aizen. The megalomaniac knew of his existence as evidenced by the modified hollow sent after him. Moreover, taking Ichigo would be a morale blow to Kisuke and the Visored. It would also provide Aizen with the chance to study his powers, which the possibility of him knowing about was high. If it was Aizen, then the terror brewing in Ichigo's chest, shaking its way to his fingers, would soon become overwhelming because Ichigo was 9 and Aizen was a genius on par with Kisuke. But before that, Ichigo needed to discover where he was. If he was in Soul Society, then Ichigo would have to be aware of enemies on all fronts, but he would have the possibility of allies in Kakushiba, a friend of Yoruichi. If he was in the mortal world, then the possibilities were endless and Ichigo, a 9-year-old kid, would have to find a way to contact Kisuke. If he was in Hueco Mundo, reportedly Aizen's base of operation according to his plans for the Espada, then Ichigo would have to find a place to wait it out. Reaching out with his Reiatsu, Ichigo searched for presences in his surroundings. He knew there were ways to hide Reiatsu. Kisuke had shown him the strange black cloak that made it feel like he wasn't there. But if this building served as a place of operation to whoever had kidnapped him, then they were likely comfortable and wouldn't hide their Reiatsu. There were 5 presences Ichigo could sense in a 2-kilometer radius, all that he could sense without thinning his Reiatsu out and risking a lack of technique. 3 of the Reiatsu presences he could sense were Shinigami and the other 2 were distinctively hollow. It didn't bode well for Ichigo's suspicions. Deciding he had deduced all he could while laying down, Ichigo inhaled slowly and sat up. The room was overbearingly white, in a way that almost physically hurt Ichigo's eyes. It was also mostly empty. The only noticeable thing in the room was the bed he was laying on, more of a cot really, and a table. There was also a window, metal bars blocking the small square and letting sparse beams of a softer light fall through them. There was a door and Ichigo was almost certain that it was locked, but he would attempt it anyway once Zangetsu returned. In the meantime, Ichigo rose to his feet standing on the bed and peered out of the small window. A sea of sand spread out beneath the window, pale almost white. It seemed to go on endlessly, stretching beyond the horizon uninterrupted except for a stray barren shrub. The sky was dark like the night in the mortal world, but there was something to it that felt different. Ichigo belatedly realized there were no stars, just passing shadows that may have been clouds. Hueco Mundo. Ichigo was in Hueco Mundo, the world of hollows. Or at least from what Kisuke had said of the word through his reports, it was Hueco Mundo. Ichigo slid down from the window and stared at the wall for a moment. He focused on his breathing and tried not to hyperventilate as he realized that it was almost certainly Aizen who had kidnapped Ichigo. He knew as dread settled in his chest and overwhelmed his breathing that his rescue would be far more difficult than it could be otherwise. The door to the room he was in slid open. It was silent and automatic, and all that signified such was a hiss of compressed air. Ichigo tensed before he forced himself to relax and turn around. Present yourself as strong and in control. That was what Benihime always lectured in any situation. She would then proceed to correct his posture till it fit her grueling standards. There was something not human standing in the doorway, but it was humanoid in figure, if slightly too skeletal and pale. By process of elimination, Ichigo concluded that the being in front of him was an Arrancar, an Espada, likely created by Aizen. It stepped into the room, a tray held on its hand as blank green eyes fell on Ichigo. There was nothing aggressive to its Reiatsu, but all the same, there was something empty that left an unsettling feeling clinging to Ichigo as his breath calmed slightly. They stared at each other in silence, something curious there as the being wondered at the boy and the boy wondered at the being. Finally, the Espada stepped forward and placed the tray on the table. It contained something that appeared to be food, though Ichigo wouldn't believe it to actually be such. The Espada turned as if to exit and Ichigo jerked at the movement. Some part of him didn't want to be left alone in the room even if he knew that Zangetsu would return and that this hollow was his enemy. The being continued to walk forward and Ichigo acted on impulse and said, "Wait, what is your name?" They stilled at the question and turned to face Ichigo. With a curious tilt of the Espada's head, the movement highlighting the horn attached to their mask, the being stared at him with something sparking behind their eyes. Ichigo waited in silence and wondered if the Espada would answer him. "Ulquiorra," they intoned. Their voice was like the sound of water running into a drain. Ulquiorra stared at Ichigo for a moment longer, his features twisted minutely before he exited, the automatic door sliding shut behind him with a hiss. Ichigo slumped with an exhale, still cautious that he was being watched, or rather almost certain considering that once he had moved visibly someone had appeared. Scrubbing a hand over his features in the same way he had seen Kisuke do, Ichigo wondered if he would ever return home. If he would see his sisters again. Would he be forced to stay in this cold, washed-out place forever? How would he survive? Was there any food? There would be hollows everywhere, all of them starving. Ichigo could be smart, he was powerful, but all of that wouldn't help him in this situation. Not when the forces against him were stacked. He just wanted his family, the Visored, Tessai, Kisuke, Yoruichi, even his dad to just come and save him. Because? Ichigo was 9 and he wasn't ready, wasn't prepared for this. Swallowing back the sobs building in his throat, Ichigo tucked his face into his knees and blinked away the tears burning behind his eyelids. He wondered if he would ever feel the warmth of his sister's hugs, taste Yuzu's budding culinary skills, see Kisuke smile proudly at him. A part of Ichigo knew they wouldn't leave him here in Hueco Mundo. But the thought persisted, and he wondered if Kisuke would be able to find a way to create a Garganta, or if the Visored would connect enough with their spirits to figure it out. Arms curled around Ichigo, full of warmth and radiating Reiatsu that was inherently familiar and comfortable. Ichigo glanced up through the tears in his eyes to see Zangetsu's face staring at his own. A hand stroked gently down Ichigo's back in a way that reminded him of his mother, and Ichigo curled into his Zanpakuto spirit, taking comfort in the presence. He wasn't alone. Ichigo had his powers, he had his spirits. And if he could escape, there was a chance he could return to the mortal world, there was a chance he could be fine. That's the spirit, Ichigo. Keep moving forward. Never hesitate, don't let your fears stop you, if you hesitate you won't survive. Zangetsu whispered, the words filled Ichigo's chest with warmth and stopped the panicked thoughts that had flooded his mind. Breathing out slowly, Ichigo pulled away from his spirit and wiped away the tears clinging to his cheeks. He needed to focus, he couldn't afford another breakdown, not when he was dealing with someone of Aizen's caliber, someone who even now had their claws sunk into the structure of Soul Society. What did you find? Ichigo questioned. In his mind, he couldn't risk anything being detected. Zangetsu frowned, his expression serious as his fingers curled into Ichigo's shirt. The spirit sighed and stated, I found an exit to this place, which is like a maze at best. However, if Aizen isn't distracted it will be hard to escape. But I can guide you. From there, if we can hide your Reiatsu, Hueco Mundo's endlessness should help to hide you until Kisuke appears. The word sent dread and hope pounding through his veins in equal measure as Ichigo listened to his Zanpakuto spirit's words. They needed a distraction, something that would distract the residents of whatever this building was. Though there was a risk in waiting for a distraction, it allowed time for Aizen to enact whatever plot he had planned, for them to meet face to face. Ichigo knew that if they worked together they might still be able to escape, but they both knew it would be dangerous, perhaps unnecessarily so. There were still hollows waiting in the sands, and once there it would be equally difficult for Kisuke to find him. But he couldn't hesitate. A loud boom echoed and shuddered through Ichigo's room, rattling dust from the ceiling and continuing to reverberate through the silence of Hueco Mundo. Ichigo and Zangetsu shared a look, both weren't keen to question their fortune. For a moment, Ichigo contemplated that it was his family here to rescue him, but the likelihood of mounting a force and finding a way into Hueco Mundo in what was presumably at least a day was unlikely. Zangetsu stood and Ichigo followed his spirit to stride across the floor on soundless feet till they were before the seam of wall Ulquiorra had entered through. The door was locked, but Ichigo could detect a Kido that appeared complex but had a key flaw in its locking mechanism. Channeling the Kido Tessai had shown Ichigo when he had asked about the locks on Kisuke's lab, Ichigo broke open the seal with a small, almost unnoticeable burst of Reiatsu. The door hissed open onto a hallway, empty and glaringly white like the rest of the world. Ichigo peered around the edges of the doorway, searching with both Reiatsu and his eyes for anything that would risk their escape plan. There was nothing, just the tail end of something white and a bit of blue, not fabric, disappearing around the corner. Ichigo traded a glance with Zangetsu, who was grim and serious in a way that reminded him of the funeral. The Zanpakuto spirit brushed a hand through Ichigo's hair before he stepped into the hallway and turned left without hesitation. Ichigo followed after the spirit, moving on soundless feet with his Reiatsu tucked close to him. They would escape, and they would return home. X. The door to the central room of the Urahara Shiten slid open with a bang, not with intended force, but for the situation it was understandable. The sound was hardly noticeable above the infernal din of multiple voices yelling at each other and just pure yelling. Kisuke, with his forehead planted on the table, didn't glance up. He already knew who it was. Everyone else was accounted for. Had been since 3 in the morning. It was 12 in the afternoon now. Not that Kisuke knew that with a definite clarity. He felt bone exhausted in a way that wasn't just set into his body but was driving a wedge through his thoughts. Damn it! He needed to be alert, needed to think of something, anything. Because Ichigo was somewhere, lost, kidnapped. Kami knew they had suspicions, and anything could be happening to him. He had failed Mosoki. When she had died, Kisuke had promised to take care of Ichigo, promised to make sure the kid grew up properly. But now Ichigo was gone and he had failed. Failed. What could he have done differently? How could he have stopped this from happening? Why? He should have had more surveillance on the kid, could have warned Ichigo of Aizen better, should have done anything to stop this. That wasn't true though, and he knew it. If he had become that overprotective, the kid would have stagnated. Paranoia was only as good as it allowed you to live. But that didn't change the fact that Ichigo was gone, stolen from his bed in the middle of the night. That was the time frame they had, like a changeling from Western mythology. It stung and burned, clawed at the protective instincts that had instilled themselves in Kisuke. The others felt it too, and were just as miserable. A thunk sounded vaguely in front of Kisuke's face, and the scientist peered through his mop of tangled hair to peer at a mug. The scent of coffee, blacker than obsidian, was in front of him. Kisuke's eyes dragged slowly up from the mug to Tessei, who was sitting opposite him, arms crossed over his chest and a frown curling his lips. The normally stoic man, Kisuke's best friend, someone like a godparent to Ichigo, was equally distraught by the situation. But as ever where Kisuke was a mess, Tessei somehow managed to stay composed. An arm curled around Kisuke's shoulder along with a warm body pressed to his side. Glancing slowly to the side, Kisuke glimpsed the bright gold of Yoruichi's eyes, furious and burning in equal measure. They were challenging all the same, but this time there was more on the line. Kisuke resisted the urge to let his head thunk on the table once more and dwell in a sorrowful well of self-pity. Instead, with a breath of courage, Kisuke picked up the mug and tipped back the burning liquid. It burned and tasted like tar, but it was enough of an awakening for Kisuke to sip at the rest of it as his eyes surveyed the room. Kenshi was pacing in a small circle. Every few seconds he paused and took a deep breath wherein Kisuke could see the beginning of a mask fade away. Mashiro sat in a seat close by, staring at the ceiling with a worried frown and a lack of cheer that in of itself was worrying. Lisa was reading, or rather attempting the motion before she would pause and scrub a hand over her face, flaking away white scales. Love and Rose were settled near the doors, limbs overlapping. They had been in the basement with Hachi for a half hour before they returned. Hachi himself was settled to the left of Tessa, and now that Kisuke was rehabilitated, the two were chatting. Hiyuri and Shinji were yelling at each other. The others had been yelling, but they must have stopped at some point, though for what reason Kisuke could only name Yoruichi. He could see it in Shinji's features. The man was desperate, that and furious like the rest of them, barely holding on to composure for Ichigo's sake alone. Isshin stood in front of the door. The father wasn't looking at anyone, just his own hands, but Kisuke couldn't imagine what it was like for the man. To have none of your powers when you needed them the most. To be at risk of not only losing your wife, but also your son. To the same man. Kisuke could read the devastation in Isshin's shoulders, and it was mirrored in his own. They needed to start planning, needed to settle everything. When everyone had first arrived, they had tried, but it had only devolved into useless debates. The longer they waited and argued and moped, then the more time Ichigo was in Aizen's hands. Spreading his Reiatsu out in a sudden flush that slammed the walls and rattled the glasses, Kisuke let the silence fall around him as he sipped at the horrible-tasting coffee and let the silence brew. Enough, Kisuke started before he moved to his feet and to a large blackboard that he often used for inventions, and the others' groceries. Picking up a piece of chalk, Kisuke turned to everyone and continued, "We cannot waste any more time. Every moment we spend arguing and debating Ichigo's life, he could be in danger, and we are sitting here. We need to establish a location, who abducted him, and a plan of operation. Silence followed the statement, and Kisuke could sense a feeling of shame and guilt in the room before it slowly transformed into determination. Nodding to himself as he sipped at the kami-blessed coffee, Kisuke turned to Yoruichi and asked, "Yoruichi, have your contacts in Soul Society confirmed anything?" The Shihin princess nodded once, sharp and serious, reminiscent of the fearsome military commander she had once been. Brushing a hand through her hair, she replied, "Confirmed, Ichigo is not in Soul Society. No one has any indication that such a person exists." Love, Rose, did you find anything when you looked into the other supernatural residents of Karakura town? Kisuke questioned, turning his attention to the two Visored, who were the best at diplomacy, of course, next to Kisuke. Rose and Love traded a glance before Rose responded, "Nothing, they've all heard nothing of the kid, and our external contacts hadn't heard anything either." Kisuke nodded and ran a hand over his stubble before he pulled the cannibalized satellite out of his pocket and flicked through the screens. After a minute he glanced up at his audience and added, "According to what we know of the plausible kidnapper, known locations within the mortal world, and my satellite surveillance, the likelihood of Ichigo being in the mortal world is 25%. 25%, that's still a whole freaking lot, Kisuke." Shinji shouted back, his voice echoing in a rasp that was all too obvious of Shinji's emotional state. At the same time, Hachi commented mildly, "That means he is almost certainly in Hueco Mundo, of which we have no notable entrance point." The comment sent the room into a flurry of motion once more as Hiyuri rose to her feet and snapped out insults. Mashiro frowned at a wall with a fierce expression that didn't fit her face. Shinji alternated between glaring at Kisuke and yelling at Hiyuri. Kisuke sighed but turned to face the chalkboard and began to place what they knew and what their objectives and obstacles were. Isshin stood as still as a statue. His blank expression was not enough to hide the fury and helplessness radiating from him. After 10 minutes, when the noise had settled somewhat, Kisuke turned around and once more snapped his Reiatsu out. Everyone paused and turned to face Kisuke, who smiled in a deceptively calm manner even as he channeled Uno Hanataisho incredibly well. Clapping his hands together and forcing a semblance of joy into the motion, Kisuke continued, "Well, now that I have everyone's attention once more, let's discuss our plan of attack. Someone should stay in the mortal world just in case Ichigo is here," Love suggested after a minute of silence where everyone traded prompting glances. Kisuke beamed at Love even though the gesture struck at him wrong. He could almost feel Benihime echoing the emotion. "Excellent point. It is perfect then that Hachi and Yoruichi have volunteered to stay behind and monitor both Soul Society and the mortal world," Kisuke added, and let the attention drift to the two, away from him. Yoruichi nodded only once in acknowledgement, her eyes connecting with Kisuke in a silent promise. Many forgot in the face of Yoruichi's charms that the Onmitsukid were masters at gathering information. There was a reason Kisuke was as sharp as he was, both literally and metaphorically, and it wasn't because of his time at the academy. "Why is Hachi staying?" Hiyuri questioned, somewhat petulantly, with a frown as she crossed her arms and glared at Kisuke. Muttering a prayer under his breath, as one should when dealing with the midget of terror, Kisuke smiled banally and responded, "We don't know how your hollow sides will react to Hueco Mundo. It is safer to have a Kido master who is not also a Visored, no?" A few of them glared at him for the insinuation, however true it was, while others turned their attention to Hachi, who nodded only once in acceptance. For Ichigo's safety, they couldn't afford any error. "So, the question is how are getting to Hueco Mundo?" Shinji stated in a drawl, gathering the attention of the room before any more infighting could break out. Kisuke resisted the urge to flash Shinji a smile because the man was angry and needed someone or something to blame, something tangible so Kisuke would suit. "I have an invention that may be fitted to create a path to Hueco Mundo. But it is a prototype at best. It will take me at least a full day of work to see if it is even possible to make it work, at best. In the moderately okay case it could take minimum a week, worst case maximum a month." Kisuke admitted, flipping out the fan in front of his features so that he wouldn't have to feel their disappointment. He wished he could finish it in a day, but the possibility was incredibly unlikely. After all, if he stayed up for too long to work on it, it would only increase the chance of critical failures being overlooked. They stared at him in silence and Kisuke waited, he wasn't sure for exactly what. Alternate suggestions? Encouragement? Doubt? A hollow can open a garganta. If we can connect with our spirits, we could learn how to. And if we all try, then the chance of one of us achieving it is higher. If we try for Ichigo, we can't fail. Mashiro said, her tone was bright, but there was a note of steel beneath it that was almost unfamiliar. The Visored stared at her, their expressions were something between shock and doubt, as if they couldn't believe her words. Kisuke personally thought it was one of the best-case scenarios. If they could, it placed them a step closer to communicating with their spirits and would provide easy transportation into Hueco Mundo. It is what Ichigo would have wanted of us most assuredly. Lisa added, adjusting the glasses on the bridge of her nose as cold eyes challenged the Visored. Kisuke could see Shinji almost physically wavering as he stared at the Visored with an expression Kisuke had seen on the man before he entered battle. There is nothing else that will force us to make contact with our spirits such as this. We must do this for Ichigo. Rose added sagely, the words echoing with truth, because in the end, Ichigo only wanted to help people, and if they managed it well, Kisuke could imagine the way Ichigo would beam at them. Shinji stepped forward, gathering the attention of the room. He turned to Kisuke and stated, "Work on that damn invention and don't worry about us." He turned to the Visored, staring at each of them in turn, and continued, "We're going to do this if we have to break our bones, because we are not leaving Ichigo behind." Rietsu seemed to pulse about the room and Kisuke nodded once, already running over the plans in his mind. If they could do it, they would. If not, Kisuke would just need to be prepared. Glancing across the room, Kisuke caught sight of Isshin staring at them all with something lost on his features. As the Visored gathered around Shinji, Kisuke slipped towards the former captain. "Do you think we'll get him back?" Isshin questioned, soft and vulnerable in a way one rarely saw of the enigmatic man. Kisuke placed a hand on Isshin's shoulder and forced the man to look into his eyes, to see the conviction burning there with the same determination Ichigo had shown them in everything. "We will find him. Ichigo will return home. In the meantime, you need to be at home with the twins, keep them safe and fed. Ichigo wouldn't want to return home to find his house in ruins." Isshin choked out a laugh and wiped at his eyes superstitiously for a moment before, with a rough bark of laughter, he responded, "Yeah. Kami knows Raiken's already trying to corrupt them at the moment." Isshin paused, suddenly serious, and with his eyes burning like in Jetsu he added, "Find my son Kisuke." Kisuke nodded. They wouldn't let Ichigo down as Soul Society had for them. They would find him even if they had to fight through all of Aizen's forces. Ichigo was family, and you didn't turn your back on family. It was cold, the kind of cold that was biting and cut through skin and bone to chill you to the core cold. Zangetsu's warmth cloaked around him could only do so much. There was nothing to stop the fierce gales of wind that swept over the plains of Hueco Mundo, the way it kicked sand into the air in great sweeps that were temporarily blinding. The sand beneath his feet constantly shifted, making every step difficult, as if he was walking through a viscous liquid. Briefly, Ichigo had contemplated solidifying Rietsu beneath his feet so that he could walk above the sand, but that was dangerous. It could attract the attention of nearby hollows. Already, Ichigo had been halted by a few hollows, all seeking out his Rietsu. They had been lower-level hollows, but that didn't dissuade the possibility of an Ajuchas or even a Vasto Lord. It didn't help that everything looked the same. Sometimes he felt as if he had been walking in circles and that he had passed the same barren shrub twice. There were no guiding stars in the sky, and the moon didn't change position, it just grinned on and on at the world below it. When Ichigo had escaped with Zangetsu, he had turned once to see Aizen's base of operations. It had been huge and white like a pockmark on the otherwise barren sand, rising far above Ichigo and spreading out for miles. Now there was nothing. He had understood then why they had twisted and turned through so many passages in the large building. Zangetsu pausing every few seconds to glance around a corner or stare at a crossroads. They turned back a few times when they stumbled upon a dead end or something significantly not an exit. But they had exited, and now Ichigo was walking over the rolling sand as the cold ripped through his clothes and the world around him remained unceasingly the same. Some part of Ichigo wanted to keep glancing behind himself, to make sure that Aizen wasn't cresting the last hill with an army of hollows surrounding the megalomaniac. There was a constant fear that was burrowing its way through his veins, heightening his awareness and making the shadows more than they were. Ichigo paused, his breath hitched, and he sunk to his knees, curled his arms around his chest and wished it was over. He had no idea where he was going, what he was going to do, how Kisuke was going to find him. What if Aizen found him? What would the man do to Ichigo? He just wanted to go home. No. He couldn't do this. Couldn't sit on the sand feeling sorry for himself, not when he wasn't safe, when there was still a risk of Aizen finding him. Even if he felt so incredibly lost. Ichigo breathed slowly and wiped away the tears that had started to fall. He would return home, Ichigo had to believe that. In the meantime, he had to keep moving, he couldn't hesitate. Struggling to his feet, Ichigo tugged his pajama shirt closer to his chest to protect against the chill and gazed at the horizon. He wondered if there were any ruins in Hueco Mundo, other than Aizen's base, because the world felt so startlingly empty in a way that seemed to defy the existence of Soul Society and the mortal world. There was no infrastructure, just the sand, so he wondered if there was more to Hueco Mundo than he could see. Zangetsu materialized with a small swirl of sand. He stared at Ichigo with eyes that blazed and mourned and were filled with something Ichigo couldn't quite understand. The spirit tugged off the dark grey hari he sometimes wore and settled it on Ichigo's shoulders. It dragged on the ground but was weightless, and it was filled with an incredible warmth. The spirit didn't say anything, but Ichigo could understand what he wasn't saying. Spreading his Reiatsu out a bit, Ichigo started walking again, over the sands past the same dreary dead shrubs, under the watchful eyes of the moon. The silence of Hueco Mundo was unnerving. Ichigo hadn't noticed it before when his thoughts had been screaming about his head, but now in that overwhelming silence, it seemed to echo in his thoughts. It was almost peaceful. Almost. He wondered how everyone was coping at home. What his dad had said to the twins. Probably something about him going to camp in the middle of the school year. Chad was probably worried about him, and he wouldn't have anyone to watch his back when the local Yakuza decided to be intolerant. But he wasn't worried. Chad could take of himself in a fight. Kisuke was probably holed up in his laboratory trying to find a way into Hueco Mundo while also simultaneously inventing something to track Ichigo. Benihime was probably scowling at her wielder and huffing moodily, as the spirit was wont to do. The Visored were probably all huddled in the warehouse. Maybe Love and Rose were playing music, or Lisa had commandeered the stereo again. Mashiro was probably practicing acrobatics while Kenshi watched, secretly terrified for her, but looking impassive. Hachi was probably drinking with Tessai while the two discussed how to create a Kido that would create water or something. Shinji and Hiyuri were probably fighting again, that or Shinji was brooding impressively. Or maybe they were all training. Ichigo's thoughts petered off as he became aware of something on the periphery of where his Reiatsu was spread out. Frowning, Ichigo glanced around himself and focused on the presence. It wasn't moving towards him, it was static. In the distance, amid the pale sand, Ichigo could sort of make out something. It was indistinct and blurry due to the distance, but there was something. It wasn't a mirage. Materializing Zangetsu's sealed blade, Ichigo tugged the spirit's hari closer to his body and moved forward over the sands. He was wary. It could be a trap or a hollow waiting for its next meal. But it was in the direction he was heading in, and he needed to be certain. Ichigo knew it was impulsive and that Benihime would probably berate him later, but Ichigo had already decided, so he continued walking. As Ichigo drew closer, the something sharpened into a heavy Reiatsu presence, and all around him, the bodies of hollows began to stack up. Ichigo paused to look at one of the hollows. It was sprawled on the ground, Reiatsu fading with no wounds visible. Ichigo frowned, his brow crinkling as he considered the cause. Kisuke had taught him that for a hollow to gain power it had to consume soul, so sometimes they cannibalized each other. But these hollows had no wounds that would suggest that. Moreover, if a Shinigami had killed them, then they would have dissipated and moved on to Soul Society. This was something else. Ichigo tensed before he physically forced himself to react. He needed to be careful. Whoever or whatever was in front of him was dangerous and unknown. Ichigo tried to recall what Benihime would advise in a situation like this. She would probably counsel either waiting or trying some reconnaissance. Ichigo wasn't good at controlling his Reiatsu unfortunately, and he couldn't wait. He needed to move forward. Feeling Zangetsu's presence surrounding him, Ichigo walked forward, watching with wide eyes as all around him the hollows stacked up in an imitation of the landfills Ichigo had seen pictures of. Finally, Ichigo reached what was likely the center of the whole paradox. There was something cloaked in a thick tan fabric in the center of a circle. Piled high around the cloaked figure were the corpses of hollows. Ichigo could feel the presence clearly now. It pushed on his body like gravity and threatened to drown him if he didn't surround himself with Reiatsu. The Reiatsu was distinctively hollow. There was the same acridness that he had encountered before, but there was also something wild and powerful. Grasping Zangetsu's hilt, Ichigo walked forward. His feet on the sand were impossibly loud as he moved closer. He noticed that the cloaked hollow had its back turned to him, so he diverted to one side to walk around to face it. The hollow didn't react, didn't stir, but for the biting wind that prowled and whistled over the sand. Ichigo stopped when he was in front of the hollow and sat down, his Reiatsu coiled tightly around him. He waited. After what felt like an eternity, the hollow shifted, the fabric moving with it, and glanced at him. It looked human. That was the first thought to spring into Ichigo's mind as he stared into blue eyes and observed the brown hair tangled around the man's features, the fragment of a hollow mask attached to his jaw. The Arrancar, because it had to be one, stared back in shock, observing Ichigo with incredulity. A human? The hollow questioned in a voice like a growl. The fabric shifted, and another face appeared. She looked young, like Yuzu or Karen, with blonde hair and a hollow mask on her head. She stared at Ichigo with obvious excitement. For a moment Ichigo contemplated the likeliness of conjoined twins before dismissing the notion for the more logical observation that they were two hollows. The older hollow shook his head and continued, "Not a human, but not." He trailed off and continued to stare at Ichigo, who stared in return. They didn't feel aggressive, and there was something intelligent in their gazes, something so entirely human that the thought hurt. "Who are you?" the blonde hollow asked with a tilt of her head. Even as the older one glanced at her with something like a warning, it reminded him of the twins. Ichigo settled Zangetsu on the ground beside him and replied, "I'm Ichigo Kurosaki." "And you?" "Lilynette, and this is Stark." The girl hollow responded, gesturing to her companion, with a bit of bite in her voice, who was still studying Ichigo. Stark yawned and blinked lazily for a moment at Ichigo. It wasn't enough to disarm him of the sharpness he had seen moments before. "What are you doing in Hueco, Mundo, Ichigo?" Stark questioned with a raised brow before he continued, "And I suppose the potent question is, how are you not being destroyed by our Reiatsu?" Ichigo frowned and stared at his hands for a moment. In the half-light of Hueco Mundo they looked too pale and strange, as if they weren't his own. Feeling Zangetsu's Reiatsu surrounding him, encouraging him to follow his instincts, Ichigo glanced up and responded, "I was kidnapped." By a Shinigami." He paused but then looked up with a grin and continued earnestly, "I have a lot of Reiatsu as well, so I just tucked it around myself like a cloak. It must be hard having so much Reiatsu that no one else can get close to you." Stark blanched at Ichigo's words and stared at him as if a man seeing water for the first time. Lilynette smiled back at Ichigo and stretched forward hesitantly as if she wanted to see if he was real. Stark planted a hand on her head and tousled Lilynette's head till she was pouting up at the man. Stark turned his attention to Ichigo, and with something rumbling in his chest he asked, "A Shinigami kidnapped you?" The faux brightness Ichigo had tugged over his features fell away and he nodded, drawing his knees up to his chest. He replied quietly, "Yeah, he wants to destroy Soul Society, but he's a megalomaniac, so I guess he just wants to destroy things or dominate the world. I think it's because of my powers." Stark and Lilynette stared at Ichigo for a moment before the blonde darted from the shelter of her cloak and wrapped her arms around Ichigo. He startled back and almost tipped over at the sudden motion before he hesitantly wrapped his arms around Lilynette. A low chuckle broke the silence of Hueco Mundo, and Ichigo glanced up from the safe halo of Lilynette's arms to see Stark gazing at the two of them with something kind and warm to his eyes. It was a sudden change to the wariness emanating from the Arrancar. After a minute Lilynette pulled back and stared into Ichigo's eyes. In a tender voice she questioned, "Is anyone coming to look for you, Ichigo?" The question brought back the silence, though it was tense like a wire stretched between the three of them. Ichigo frowned and curled his hands into fists as he responded, I know they're going to try. But Hueco Mundo is a big place and I don't want to be found by the Shinigami. Stark shuffled closer to the two and ruffled both Ichigo and Lilynette's hair with something consoling to the sharpness of his features. Pulling back from the hug, Ichigo tugged a smile over his features and grinned at the two Arrancar. So, are you two related? Lilynette pouted and shot a glare at Stark for a moment before she nodded. Stark stared at Ichigo, likely seeing the diversion for what it was, his eyes flicking between the orange-haired kid and Lilynette before he questioned, do you know what this Shinigami wants and why he is in Hueco Mundo? The question forced Ichigo's smile to flicker and die as his hand tightened around Zangetsu's hilt. Ichigo nodded and couldn't hold it against the hollow for digging for information, it could possibly affect the two in the future. Drawing on Zangetsu's presence, Ichigo replied, his name is Aizen. He wants to use this powerful device to make Arrancar more powerful and make an army that will serve him. At least that's what I know of his plan. He's set up in Los Notches, isn't he? Stark questioned, his features grim as he stared past the bodies surrounding them. Ichigo tilted his head in confusion at the unfamiliar name and a ghost of a smile that showed too many teeth stretched across his features as he added, it's a big white building, mostly ruins, but the wind has carried rumors and on occasion we see a hollow that lives long enough to talk for a few minutes. Ichigo nodded in answer, processing the information he had been given. He couldn't imagine having one person to talk to for months on end. Stark frowned once more before the expression slipped away from his features to be replaced with warmth. Lilynette curled up against Stark's side and stared at Ichigo for a moment before she suggested, you could stay with us, Ichigo? At least till your family comes. He considered the proposition. Stark and Lilynette weren't aggressive, they weren't hungry, and their own power prevented any hollows from trying to attack. But if Ichigo remained with them, he put the two Arrancar at risk of Aizen finding them. The likelihood of Aizen discovering the two in the future was already highly probable, but he didn't want to hasten it. Zangetsu materialized behind Ichigo, his arms wrapped over his shoulder as he said in a quiet whisper by Ishigo's ear. You can trust them, Ichigo, you need to rest. But you are correct, it is not safe to remain here. Ichigo glanced into Stark's eyes with an apology because he could see the isolation surrounding the two Arrancar, the bodies surrounding them. He didn't understand that sort of loneliness, but he could understand the desperation when you wanted something. Needed something with all your soul. Stark nodded in understanding but allowed Ichigo to speak nonetheless. I can't stay here too long, it's not safe, not with Aizen after me. But I can still stay for a bit. He replied slowly, the words heavy on his tongue. Lilynette frowned, the expression making her look younger, but traded a glance with Stark and nodded. He wondered if the two were connected in some way, like how he and Zangetsu were connected. Stark nodded and ruffled a hand through Ishigo's hair. In that voice like gravel he responded, it's okay, Ichigo, we'll meet again, that much is obvious. But when you leave, go west, there might be something to aid you out there. Ichigo nodded his thanks and grinned at the Arrancar as he ruffled Ishigo's hair. The hollow paused for a second before he returned the grin, something tender in his gaze. Lilynette beside the man jostled his shoulder and waved to get Ishigo's attention. Tell us about the mortal world, Ichigo, she demanded, planting her hands on her hips with a petulant expression. Stark chuckled and leaned back on the sand with an interested expression. Ichigo smiled and wondered where to start. Eventually, he began, well, in the mortal world, we have buildings that touch the skies. Shinji twisted in mid-air, spinning away from the blade that crackled with Reiatsu. It had appeared from behind in a left swipe, so, accordingly, Shinji had moved in the same direction and watched as the directions were mirrored in the planes of his inner world. Sakan's Reiatsu slammed into the glass-like floor, spreading cracks and fissures that wouldn't seal over for days, even as the wrathful spirit flew forward. Shinji swung his katana down, the circular part of the weapon spinning through his fingers as the two blades clashed in opposing directions. Her eyes were gold, they burned and accused as they stared into Shinji's eyes. White filled his vision as the glass-like material flew into the air, reflecting the light around them and temporarily blinding him. Please, he said once quietly as he struggled against Sakan's blade. It always felt in his inner world as if she held greater strength. This was her domain in truth, and here the laws of gravity, which he was well acquainted with, could easily be challenged. The spirit didn't react to his quiet plea. Her eyes stared unseeingly past him, and all Shinji could hear was the screaming in his mind, like nails on a chalkboard, or caterwauling cats. Shinji stepped forward and appeared a few steps away. He watched as the linen-like fabric in shades of silver like polished metals floated ethereally around Sakan's head and avoided the mask carved to her features. It felt too much like looking at a stranger, like staring at someone you had once known, and perhaps it was. "Please, for Ichigo, we need to cooperate," Shinji begged, his voice quiet and cracking, something he would never admit to if asked, something that they both knew he prided himself on never doing. Her eyes, burning their way through him, swerved towards Shinji, and in a voice that rasped and broke terribly she replied, "No." Then the world was tilting in horrible vertigo, shifting and multiplying around Shinji as she flew forward, her blade poised to strike. Shinji closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that time, like any sense of perception within his inner world, was an eschewed concept. Flicking his weapon in a whirl, Shinji heard the shriek of metal clashing together, and opened his eyes. Suddenly, the two blades were crashing against one another with all the force of an incoming tide. Down was up and left was right, and Shinji could only lose himself so much in the battle. He hissed when she scored a long gash on his chest, but refused to take the split-second opening he saw. This wasn't a fight for dominance, and even then, some part of Shinji could hardly bring himself to willfully harm Sakan, even if she had no hesitations herself. All around him in the mirrored surface his own form stared back at him with gold eyes, cold smiles, and taunting words. Shinji felt helpless and on the brink. They needed to make contact with their spirits. Ichigo's life was at stake, and here he was trapped fighting himself. This was the 7th time in 3 days Shinji had submerged himself in his conscious. His moment of inattention costed Shinji as Sakan's blade speared through his arm, blood spraying through the air to decorate the mirrors and leave dark trails. Shinji panted and stared at his Zanpakuto spirit. She looked down at him, and her blade hovered below or above her head, ready to strike, ready to kill. With a burst of Reiatsu, Shinji disappeared and didn't wonder why she let him go. There were places to hide in his inner world. For all that everything seemed reflective, there were points where one could sink into the spaces between, the shadows, and rising from the simple plains were pyramids, simple mastabas, but also ones like in Egypt, or some shaped like temples. They were all empty, and the light within his inner world felt almost artificial at times. Before Aizen, before holification, his world had been different. The key elements were there, but before there had been doors, and polished metals like braziers that gleamed and crackled, orbs that floated with memories, dust on glass pillars, and crystal butterflies that winged through emotions. That had all been destroyed. It was empty and clinical and harsh, and the light that shone was that like vengeance, blinding and hurtful. Shinji slid down the wall of the interior of a pyramid, his reflection shattering around him in hues of bronze and too much white. He placed his head in his hands, so he didn't have to look. How were they supposed to do this? How was he? Ichigo had said the first step was to accept it. Hadn't they done that already? They were bitter and sought vengeance, but they were alive, they had their powers, they accepted their situation. Were they supposed to accept the monster that inhabited their soul? A representation of all the darkness inside. They were centuries old. The kind of darkness they housed was not one to contemplate. The kid's words played over and over again in Shinji's mind, shuffling around and around as he tried to make sense of it. Acceptance. Accept what? His hollow hid the darkest part of himself, the spirit he fought. He had tried, they all had. He had begged her, pleaded with her to see that they needed their powers to save Ichigo. But Sakan didn't respond, didn't care. She seemed to stare past him no matter what he did, unless she was trying to kill him. Steps echoed through the pyramid, his only warning. The sound sent a bolt of fear and dread to course down his throat like bitter liquor. Shinji shuddered, but gripped the hilt of his weapon. For a moment he paused and ran his fingers over the blade and remembered Soul Society. A drop of blood welled on his finger, and he knew he couldn't waste any more time as she appeared. Sakan was all feline grace. Before the mask, her features had been slightly akin to a Siamese cat, and her bones had always seemed unnatural thin, as if she was a two-dimensional figure. Now that lethal grace slammed Shinji against a wall as their blades crashed and cracked against one another. Around them the walls of the pyramid shook, even fit together perfectly, glass shards filled the air and spilt on the floor around them. Shinji darted into a large room which held nothing but steps on the exterior of the walls. Vaguely he thought he could identify a mosaic of something, perhaps his own reflection. His spirit crashed into him with a crackle of reiatsu, and Shinji moved to the left as the blade swung right. He slipped under it and returned a jab directed towards the ground. The elbow missed her jaw as Sakand whirled to the right, away from Shinji's blade, which had swung in the opposite direction. Why? He wondered as Sakand stepped into the air to avoid a low sweep, the swathes of her kimono floating up by the tips of her mask. Why couldn't he accept her? Was accepting her defeat? The line of questioning was paused as he whirled to the side only to fall into a blade as it sliced his cheek. He needed to pay attention, constantly calculating his every move. Sakand pushed forward, dark reiatsu pulsing around her as the glass-like substance around them creaked and groaned ominously. Shinji whirled over an overhead strike and let his own blade snap to the left, intersecting the blade cutting towards the same direction. Suddenly, Sakand reversed her blade and flung it towards the ceiling where it sunk into the floor with a mighty crack shattering it. Shinji fell into darkness, glass sparkling and leaving 1,000 tiny cuts as he fell, reaching up or down towards the ceiling. What was acceptance? Why did they hate hollows? Weren't they part of the cycle? He wondered then suddenly if he was blaming her for Aizen's plot. It wasn't their fault they were like this. And yet? Was his vengeance, his anger fueling their own twisted corruption? His back collided with the floor with a crack that was pain and burning, his mind and his body screaming in one as the glass shattered into fine dust like a powdering of snow around him. Shinji stumbled to his feet and glanced at his reflection, his weight balanced on the hoop of his weapon. He watched as Sakand surged from the glass. The long strands of her hair warped around her head and the pale mask as if she was underwater. There were tears in the gold of her eyes as she flew forward. Shinji understood. Or at least he thought he did. The blade stabbed through his heart and forced him into the wall of mirrors, and through them. The multiple images of himself shattered as he grasped the blade, blood slicking his hands, and stared into Sakand's eyes. The mask over her features began to crack, flaking away like the fine pieces of mirror reflecting everything twofold. He reached up, vaguely noticing the crimson on his fingers, to trail fingers over her cold cheek, over the tears and the shattered porcelain there, the crown on her brow. His eyes burned, and he leaned his head forward against her chest and sobbed apologies over and over. It was his fault. Shinji had locked her away, placed all the blame on her. His anger and hate and vengeance had locked them into a vicious cycle where they fed on the other's emotions and alienation. He had stopped seeing her as anything but a hollow and a tool. He had known but not understood that she was his darkness as much as the same guiding light. He had been afraid, and she had suffered, trapped in the transformation of their soul, the dichotomy of who they had been and who they had become. Shinji understood and almost wished he didn't as the sobs racked and forced their way through his chest. A hand stroked through his hair and a humming echoed in the silence as glass shattered and cracked around them. "We will save him," Sakand whispered, and Shinji knew the words were his own and Sakand, because how had he forgotten? It wasn't taught at the academy, it was discovered. She was him and he her, they were the same soul. They would not leave Ichigo behind, neither reality nor the laws of it could govern them. Sakand's laughter, vicious and rumbling as pale gold drifted by her ears, echoed and warmth blazed in his inner world and beneath her hands. Aizen stared at the monitor and frowned, displeasure curling through his system in an icy draft. The boy was gone. There was nothing in the room, no sign of a forced exit, and the recording of Ulquiorra entering revealed nothing except the Espada's own curiosity towards the human, unexpected but interesting. The footage after the event had mysteriously disappeared, and once again Aizen cursed everything from the mortal world to Soul Society, but primarily Kisuke Urahara. If he had both halves of the Hogyoku, he wouldn't have to deal with the unstable Yami, who had destroyed half of the South Wing in a rampage. Although he was powerful, he was also an arrogant brute with no understanding of control or hierarchy. A calculated risk. Aizen had only been too glad to shuffle his responsibility onto Kaname, who had divined it some exercise of justice or the like. Still, the damage to lost notches, while a powerful display, was a minor offense for its true causality. A distraction which had allowed the boy to escape. The Arrancar already under his service had searched the wide expanse of lost notches, many hallways and empty rooms. Surely the child wouldn't be able to navigate the unknown and maze-like structure, Aizen had thought. But regardless of the architectural complexity of the building, the child had escaped, nothing had been found, and there was no Reiatsu presence of the child left. The anger curled through his gut in an icy wave once more, and Aizen huffed a breath and adjusted the glasses that remained perched on the bridge of his nose. He waited patiently for the day he could reveal himself to Soul Society and claim the Hueco, and in consequence the power he deserved. But for now, he needed to find the child before Urahara could regain the prodigy whose potential to destroy him was incalculable. "Aizen-san?" Jin questioned with a sly quirk of his lips and a faux pleasant expression. Aizen regarded the Shinigami for a moment before his attention flickered to the screen. He returned his attention to the man who gave his loyalty and questioned, "You didn't see the child leave?" "Nor did anyone else?" Nothing. "Es like a ghost, Aizen-san." Jin replied with a shrug of nonchalance, even as piercing blue eyes revealed themselves for a moment of honesty or suspicion. Aizen was often pleased by the other Shinigami's masks. Nodding, Aizen recalibrated and adjusted his plans. They needed to find the child. Hueco Mundo was large, but he doubted on feet the child would be able to go far. Not to mention the lack of control on the child's large Reiatsu reserves would leave a trail. The door slid open with a hiss of compressed air, and Kaname entered and bowed to Aizen. Studying his two subordinates, who returned his gaze evenly, Aizen commanded, "Gather all our forces, barring Yami, and prepare to hunt for the child. Jin, cover for Kaname. I will handle my own appearance in Soul Society." They nodded and departed in a swirl of white before splitting in opposite directions. Aizen watched them leave for a moment before his gaze returned to the screen monitors, and he watched the footage of the child. He noticed his eyes resting on thin air and hummed. "Kyoka Suigetsu," often silent, whispered of the unseen, and Aizen concluded that the child likely had a spirit accompanying him. It was of little recourse when the child was recaptured. Aizen would be able to determine everything he needed. If that so happened to have the chance of destroying Kisuke Urahara, then that was only a pleasant side effect. After all, Aizen was nothing if not patient. The warmth of Lilynette's arms around Ichigo lingered even as he looked at his surroundings with a desolate expression. Once more, there was nothing for miles but barren trees and endless sand. Ichigo sighed and wondered if Stark had been wrong when he had said there was something to the west. Perhaps the winds had lied, they seemed the type. Though in honesty Ichigo hadn't known what to expect. Ruins? A fragment of civilization? More Arrancar? He knew it wasn't a trap, that much was clear after the short time he had spent with the two Arrancar. Lilynette, for all her blustering and snapping at Stark, genuinely cared for the older Hollow, and Stark cared for her in the same manner. They were family. Ichigo couldn't see the man who had ruffled Ishigo's hair with such a warm expression plotting anything like that, especially if it required even a modicum of effort. Stark was a lazy bastard at heart. The reassurance did nothing to solve Ishigo's current situation. Aizen was coming and Ichigo was out in the open with nothing visible for miles around. Shivering, Ichigo tugged Zangetsu's Hari closer to his body even as his stomach growled. The first time it did that he had thought it was a hollow. It was already dangerous with hollows prowling the sands, but Ichigo was hungry, tired, and Aizen had a fledgling army at his back. The odds weren't in his favor. Reiatsu whirled lightly around Ishigo's feet, and a ghost of a smile slipped across his features at Zangetsu's silent encouragement. He needed to keep moving forward. The farther he was from Aizen, the more time he had to plan, and the longer it would take to return to Hueco Mundo. Ichigo kept walking. Sometime later, with a sigh, Ichigo plopped down beside one of the barren trees and stared at the horizon. He doubted he had ever walked so much in his life, and his legs were well aware of the fact. It didn't help that the sand was beginning to shift before his eyes, and he thought at some points he could hear voices. There was no way to tell the time in Hueco Mundo. The moon was unchanging, but Ichigo could guess how long he had been in the sands, and it was well over 3 hours. Laying on his back, Ichigo stared at the dark skies above, the passing clouds, and the branches of the tree hanging over his head. It had a strange texture, nothing like the bark Ichigo had seen on the trees in the mortal world. It was pale, almost grey, and overlapped each other like scales, though the texture looked more like a rock. Tilting his head to glimpse a better view of the tree, Ichigo tentatively reached out and rested a finger on the tree. It was rough, but not overly sharp, and Ichigo wondered if there were any roots beneath the soil of Hueco Mundo. If there were roots, then it was likely there was some sort of liquid. Sitting up with a sort of desperation, Ichigo wrapped a hand around the root. For a single moment, he contemplated whether it was a good idea to tug on the tree. Ichigo's gaze surveyed his surroundings. Pale sand rolled and spread like an ocean with nothing in sight. Ichigo pulled on the tree root. There was a sound like the crunch of gravel beneath one's shoes, and Ichigo had only a moment to look around in alarm as the sand in a wide, uneven circle began to fall into a sinkhole that was slowly stretching towards him. Then the sand beneath Ichigo fell out and he was falling through the air, and something was screaming in terror. Belatedly he realized it was his own voice as a world underneath the sands plateaued beneath Ichigo and sand fell like snow around him. The ground was fast approaching as Ichigo narrowly avoided snagging Zangetsu's Haori on one of the large pillar-like trees. Blind panic flushed his system as he contemplated his imminent death when he collided with the floor far below him. He would die. Alone in the sands of Hueco Mundo, and they would never recover his body. They would never know what happened to him. Would he even go to Soul Society? A hollow would probably eat him before that. Ichigo! A familiar voice called as the ground careened ever closer, and Ichigo's mind snapped out of its shock. He closed his eyes and tried to take a breath amidst the wind rushing through his hair and biting at his skin. Gathering his Reiatsu close to his body, Ichigo solidified it beneath his hands and feet and pushed against the air, willing himself to stop moving at the will of gravity. Slowly, Ichigo came to a halt, hovering just a few feet above the ground, feeling his heart hammering unchained in his chest and the blood rushing in his ears. Exhaling, Ichigo dropped to the ground and rested in the sand for a few moments and tried not to think about his recent near-death experience. He was too young for this. A howl echoed through the air and Ichigo's body tensed as his Reiatsu spread out, searching for nearby hollows. Ichigo shouldered his way to his feet with a rushed push as he identified the Reiatsu presences of over 100 Menos and various Arrancar. There were so many in the surrounding area that it felt like the sea. It was hard to distinguish anything among the volume of it. Materializing Zangetsu's blade, Ichigo observed his surroundings, focusing on that instead of his rising panic. There was sand blanketing the ground, large spires that reached towards the ceiling where small holes cast beams of light below. In the distance, Ichigo could see a Menos, tall as a building with its pale mask harsh in the low light of the underground area, and if Ichigo squinted he thought he could see more of them in the distance. A scrape of claws was the only warning Ichigo had as he rolled out of the way, instincts blaring in his mind. It was an Ajuchas, large and hulking with a body the color of blood and a mask that draped across its features like rubber. Its large claws sent sand flying through the air as acrid yellow eyes centered on Ichigo. Scratching the back of his head, Ichigo stared at the hollow for a moment in resignation. Fortune certainly didn't favor him, Ichigo mused as he tightened his grasp on Zangetsu's blade, adrenaline pumping through his veins and gasping through his breath. The hollow bellowed, sand shaking off of the strange pillars, and charged Ichigo. Feeling Zangetsu materialize around him, Ichigo used Shienpa to dart into the air and appear behind the hollow. With Zangetsu's hands covering Ichigo's own, they brought the blade down through the hollow's mask. It crumpled to dust with a final roar, and Ichigo attempted to calm his breathing as he stood there amongst the sand in an underground cavern in Hueco Mundo. A dart embedded itself in the tree beside Ichigo's head and he whirled around to face another hollow. This one was smaller, almost akin to a frog in shape. Ichigo frowned and darted out of the way as another dart flew through the air. Just as he landed, a tail whipped out and Ichigo was forced to jump and use Reiatsu to step into the air and Shuenpa away. There was another hollow. This one was large and muscular with skin that looked infected. A dart appeared and Ichigo shot forward and raised Zangetsu, feeling Reiatsu coiling about the blade as he cleaved the frog hollow in half and whirled around to halt the large hollow's tail. Ichigo gasped as something slammed into him from behind and knocked him forward into one of the pillars. It felt as if the air was trapped in his lungs and Ichigo only barely managed to hold onto Zangetsu's blade as he blinked through blurred vision and pain. Two hollows, one of which had the tail, were standing over him. Their masks seemed harsh and cruel as they talked, the words barely reaching through the fog in Ichigo's brain. He couldn't stay still. They would eat him, and he would be dead. Ichigo would never get to see his family again. He couldn't die here. Reiatsu began to snap around Ichigo. It was dark, almost black in the dimness of the underground cavern. The hollows turned to face the child, and the one with the tail lumbered forward intent on eating the brat. A blade sliced cleanly through the hollow's mask, and then proceeded to slice through the mask of the other hollow. The two crumpled to dust and Ichigo blinked away the Reiatsu roaring through his veins and stared up at his savior. They had a hollow mask over their features, and for a second Ichigo wondered if they had intended to cannibalize the hollows before he noticed the Shihakusho and the katana. The Shinigami crouched in front of Ichigo and tipped the mask covering their features away. It was a man. He had cold, almost noble features, but they were tender where they stared at Ichigo, aching with something that was eerily familiar to Stark. "Are you okay? What are you doing here? You're a child. You shouldn't be in the Menos Forest or even Hueco Mundo for that matter," the Shinigami said in a rush, as he rested a hand on Ichigo's brow and surveyed their surroundings with a quick gaze. Ichigo blinked at the man for a moment. It felt as if there was still a fog settling over his thoughts and his body felt sluggish and slow. The Shinigami squinted at Ichigo as if noticing his state and rubbed a hand over his brow. "We need to get under cover. Can you walk?" Ichigo tried to struggle to his feet, but his chest still burned, and his legs felt weak. He had the presence of mind to dematerialize Zangetsu's blade, but little else. The Shinigami stared at him for a moment before he sighed, mumbled a creative curse under his breath, and turned around gesturing for Ichigo to climb onto his back. Suspicion lingered in the back of Ichigo's mind as he wondered if it was a trap set by Aizen, something to lure him into a false sense of security. But the Reiatsu of the man felt real, and it was all far too convoluted for such a thing. Stumbling forward, Ichigo clambered onto the man's back and ignored how nice it felt to be in contact with a human being again. The man adjusted Ichigo's grip on his shoulders and glanced over them at Ichigo before he shook his head and took off in a burst of Shoenpa. The tall spires blurred past them in a sea of white as Zangetsu's presence wrapped around him like a blanket, lulling him into something like a trance. He only vaguely noticed when they entered a cave on a high shelf and was plopped in front of a fire while the Shinigami moved around. Ichigo blinked a few times as his conscious surfaced from the sea it had been drifting in. There was a fire crackling with warmth in front of him, bathing the walls of the cave in light, dancing over hollow masks and rough-hewn furniture. The Shinigami who had rescued him was seated on the opposite side of the fire, filling away at something in his hands. As if sensing Ichigo's gaze, the man glanced up and something like a smile, but not quite one, settled on the man's features. "How are you?" he started. The light of the fire cast shadows on the sharp bridge of his nose and the hollows of his eyes. Ichigo stared at the man in silence for a moment as his mind caught up with everything, and finally he responded, "Hungry." The man laughed. The sound was quiet but sincere as he rose to his feet and shuffled towards one corner and returned with a bowl, which he passed to Ichigo. Inside was a broth with chunks of meat that Ichigo didn't want to identify. He dipped his head in thanks and sipped at the stew. It was bland but helped to abate the hunger gnawing at his stomach. "So, what's a kid like you doing in Hueco Mundo?" the Shinigami questioned before he made a soft exclamation and sheepishly continued, "I should probably introduce myself first. I guess I'm really out of practice with social necessities. My name is Ashido Khan, the former 4th seat of the 8th Division. I'm Ichigo Kurosaki. How I got here is kind of a long story," he replied, slightly reassured that the Shinigami in front of him actually acted in a human manner. Ashido blinked at Ichigo's answer, his gaze swerving towards the entrance of the cave before his attention returned, and he stated, "We've got time. I'll tell you. But you have to tell me your story," Ichigo demanded after a minute of debate. His gaze, locked onto the Shinigami, was blazing with determination. Ashido shook his head, his eyes dark, and responded, "It's not a good story, kid." "Well, do you think a story about how a 9-year-old got kidnapped is going to be funny?" Ichigo retorted petulantly as he finished the stew and stared at Ashido. He wanted to know about this Shinigami who was alone in Hueco Mundo, who had saved him. The Shinigami quirked a brow at his reply and with a resigned sigh nodded and stated, "All right, it's a deal, brat." "Go ahead, I asked first." He pouted at the logic but began detailing how his dad was a Shinigami and his mom was human, so he was powerful. Ashido thankfully only raised a brow at that part. He talked about what he knew of Aizen and how the man was using the Hueco to change Arrancar and subjugate them. Ashido frowned at the information and stared out of his cave for a long moment before he gestured for Ichigo to continue. He spoke of waking up in Los Notches, of meeting Ulquiorra, of escaping. He didn't mention Stark and Lilynette for their safety, and how he had stumbled on the Menos Forest. Ichigo trailed off after speaking of encountering the Hollows and let his gaze drift from the fire to Ashido. The Shinigami's face was curved into a frown that the light of the fire made the shadows found there seem harsh. Silence lingered in the cave, broken only by the crackle and snap of shifting wood within the fire. Finally, Ashido's gaze landed on Ichigo and with a self-deprecating smile he began. He talked of the small mission squad, the hopelessness of their situation, losing his comrades, continuing to fight for them even now. "It's really honorable of you to keep fighting like that, Ashido-san." Ichigo commented quietly as he wondered how the Shinigami in front of him could do what he did every day. Alone. At that thought, Ichigo squinted and wondered where the man's Zanpakuto spirit was. He hadn't seen a flicker of it since he entered the cave. Ashido shifted at Ichigo's words, the mask on his shoulder glowed for a moment and Ichigo made a soft sound of acknowledgement. Maybe they were used to hiding with no other spirits to associate with. Ashido's gaze was soft and vulnerable where it studied him as he replied, "Thank you, Ichigo. You have been very brave in escaping from Aizen-san. Though what you've told me doesn't bode well for Soul Society or Hueco Mundo." Ichigo beamed at the compliment and Ashido dropped whatever was in his hands at the expression. The comment about Aizen forgotten for the moment. Laughter filled the small space of the cave and through tears that were both grieved and joyful the man gasped out, "I don't think I've had someone smile at me like that for a while, Ichigo, thank you." The comment made Ichigo want to frown because he couldn't imagine that sort of life. It made him want to take Ashido back to the mortal world and show him to Yuzu. Instead, he flashed the man another smile and watched the way Ashido's eyes crinkled when he smiled back. "You're probably tired, aren't you?" Ichigo nodded in reply to the question and watched as the Shinigami stood up and gathered the bowls and washed them out with sand. From the short distance between the two, Ashido's voice drifted over, "Do you think your family will find you? It's likely that Aizen-san is searching for you." He considered the question in the ambient silence of the cave. Did he believe his family would find him? Smiling at his hands as he thought of Kisuke and Shinji appearing in a typical action movie fashion, he responded, "They'll find me, I know they will. No matter what." Ashido huffed a laugh at the honest response, but didn't say anything, just stood up and moved to the other end of the cave where the bedding was kept. Staring at the Shinigami as he worked, Ichigo felt Zangetsu's encouragement as he worked up the courage to ask a question. One that had been sown the moment Ashido had spoken of his past. Do you want to come with me, back to the human world? Or Soul Society? When they find me?" The Shinigami stopped in his movement at the question, hovering over the blankets in the sudden silence. Ichigo didn't know what to expect as an answer. He understood the reason why Ashido had chosen to stay in Hueco Mundo. But the sad truth of the matter was that with the lack of patrols in the mortal world, his efforts likely weren't influencing anything overall. And Ichigo couldn't imagine living alone like this for centuries. No company, no one to talk to. Just yourself. Alone. Ichigo wasn't sure if he would understand why Ashido would say no, but he would accept it because it would be the Shinigami's choice. Zangetsu's Reiatsu whirled around Ichigo with something like pride, and Ichigo hid a grin at the warmth it blossomed in his chest. Slowly, Ashido turned away from the bedding and padded over to crouch in front of Ichigo. In the light of the fire, his dark hair seemed to glow and Ichigo thought he could see a bit of the man's spirit coiled around the mask. A hand ruffled through his hair and Ashido smiled at Ichigo. Honest and achingly heartbreaking, the man responded, "Thanks for the offer, Ichigo." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Ichigo grinned back and let the man lead him to where a mound of furs was resting. They would figure out everything tomorrow. For now, Ichigo was warm, fed, and he could sleep without worry. Peeking out from beneath the blankets, Ichigo sleepily grinned at Ashido and whispered, "Thank you." X. The sand shook and trembled beneath Jin's feet. It leapt into the air in small arches as the air boomed with a pressure that seemed to weigh on everything. They had finally stumbled on the kid, hidden in the Menos Forest of all places. Jin admired the kid's drive to survive and stay out of Aizen's reach. If he wasn't driven by revenge, then Jin would have gotten out a long time ago. But he knew the role he played and there was no changing it. All that mattered was the end goal and the look on Aizen's face when he died. They were smoking the kid out, at least that was what Aizen related it to, and if Jin squinted a bit he could see smoke curling through the air like a vent. It would kill most of the hollows beneath the sands, but the deaths of thousands of hollows were inconsequential to Aizen. All the same, the hollows gathered behind them shifted uneasily, either aching with hunger or at the destruction so casually wrought. Their leader watched on, the glasses he wore in Soul Society tucked away for the moment, as he stared at the scene with manic eyes. It took one to know one. Kaname was in Soul Society, thankfully, after a situation had arisen in his division and the need to divert suspicion had arrived. It meant that Jin would be able to keep an eye on the kid and that he wouldn't have to listen to the blind man preach about justice. Tell it to the choir. Ichigo Kurosoki. What an enigma, certainly the kind that was a touch too intriguing for Aizen. Then again, in a roundabout sort of manner, Aizen had helped create the kid. Did that mean he was the kid's uncle? Jin doubted anyone would agree to that on either side. Aizen didn't have a shred of paternal instinct inside him. In fact, anything empathetic or requiring emotional response was usually quite fabricated. Still, the kid had the potential to defeat Aizen, and that in of itself warranted keeping an eye on the tyke. Jin knew Aizen was powerful, twice as cunning as a snake and just as vicious. He would wait for a moment of weakness to strike, but the possibility that Soul Society would do nothing, and the kid would still slot into place was high. Revenge wasn't as sweet when you weren't wielding the blade yourself, but Jin supposed he could let it go if Aizen just went and died already. With a loud crunch, the sand fell through, leaving a wide gaping hole in the middle of Hueco Mundo. A few of the hollows fell in, the weaker ones that hadn't been picked off or cannibalized on the 6-hour dash to the absolute middle of nowhere. They had almost made a detour a few hours back when the scent, so to speak, got confused and Jin had felt the huge Reiatsu presence due east. Aizen had only shot it a considering look before they continued forward. Now as the smoke drifted clearly from the hole into the crisp air, Jin wished they had stopped. If only to escape the acrid sense of burning and the boring action of waiting. With a swing of Kyoka Suigetsu, the smoke stopped, the smell drifted away, and the man directed the mass of hollows into the darkness. "Bring the boy back. Alive!" he commanded in that clinical voice that could have been automated. Jin blinked, letting his lidded gaze observe as the hollows plunged through the darkness mindlessly. What did they have to fear of an illusion? So very much. Though Jin had come to find that certain aspects of Aizen's illusions weren't perfect, how could they be when a sociopath could only replicate what it didn't understand? Not that Jin was very different. Reiatsu exploded into the air, bright and wild, and so very young in a way that reminded Jin of the Rungakai brats, of himself and Ranjiku. He opened his eyes at the sheer density of it, all compacted together into one focal point that was as powerful as a star. The kid had potential. Sand exploded outwards and Jin let his eyes close firmly shut as his Reiatsu reached out and located the fading presence of multiple hollows and that of a Shinigami, and the kid. Shaking the dust off of his Shihakusho and what he could out of his hair, Jin peered at the scene before them. A Shinigami stood in front of them, a hollow mask over his features and a pelt over his shoulders. He wasn't overly powerful Reiatsu-wise, but Jin sensed something predatory that you didn't normally find among the denizens of Soul Society. Behind the man was Ichigo. He was small like Jin had been once, and the pictures and video feed really didn't do the kid justice when it came to how shockingly orange his hair was. There was an unsheathed katana in both of their hands, and the Shinigami looked a bit worse for wear. So, that concluded what had happened to the hollows that had jumped into the gaping maw behind the kid. Aizen was frowning, Jin could feel it. Unexpected complications, as Aizen would say. Never good. Jin, however, was a fanatic when it came to unexpected complications. With a nod, the hollows surged forward, lumbering or sprinting like the mindless beasts they were. "Do not kill the child," was reiterated, the words echoing in the emptiness of Hueco Mundo. Jin doubted any of the hollows had heard or acknowledged the words. Not to mention the rather obvious loophole about eating the kid's arm as long as he was still alive. But Jin remained silent. He wouldn't interfere unless the kid was in danger. The rest was collateral damage. The two moved in tandem, admirable teamwork for two people who had obviously recently met. The silver of their blades caught the light of the moon as they cut through the hollows that surged forth, two for every one cut down, each with different augmentations, some of which were scientifically improved upon. Jin could sense the kid's eyes on them as he jumped over hollows, a burst of Kido flashing upon the sand and casting the pale white of everything into fluorescent hues. The way the kid's eyes tracked Aizen with something that wasn't fury but somewhere along the lines of righteous anger. The Shinigami at his side also seemed to glance at Aizen every so often. Maybe he had known of them in Soul Society. If so, then he was a loose end. The kid was skilled. Jin could devise that much from watching the kid weave carefully away from blow after blow, directing the energy elsewhere and utilizing every movement to his advantage. Kisuke had certainly taught the kid well, though he could also detect the influence of his former captain and the other exiles. Jin blinked, his eyes slitting open as the kid moved in a manner that he hadn't before, as if he was being guided. It certainly lent credit to Aizen's theory. The fight began to drag on. The corpses of the hollows were beginning to stack up around the two, who were visibly tiring. There was a cut on the Shinigami's back and a scratch on the kid's chin that would probably turn into a wicked scar. Jin wondered whether Aizen would let both forces exercise themselves into exhaustion before he stepped in. There was the perception he had all the time in the world, even amidst a Cold War. It happened quickly, almost in the blink of an eye. A hollow got lucky and the kid was too slow, too exhausted. Shin slipped quickly from its scabbard and into Shikai without a word as Jin prepared to save the kid's life. It would probably please Aizen. Unless he wanted the glory for himself or something to hold over the kid. Reiatsu pulsed through the air and the hollows in a semicircle around the kid, and the Shinigami disintegrated into dust. The Reiatsu was bright blue, the pure kind that Jin had only read about and seen when he entered Mayui's office. He opened an eye and glanced at the kid, whose eyes were glowing a pale blue even as he panted for breath. "Hey, interesting." Aizen quirked a brow at the unexpected display of power. Jin held little doubt the man was inordinately pleased beneath his cool veneer of polite humanity. The Shinigami stared in concern at the kid, but kept his guard up, smart. The blue glow faded from the kid's eyes, and apparently taking that as a welcome sign of opportunity or a free buffet, the hollow surged forward once more. The despair at the large force in front of the two was almost tangible. A crack rent the air. Everything paused as if time itself hesitated in the face of the growing rip in the fabric of space, dark pulses of Reiatsu surrounding the Garganta, because that was all it could be, as it reached the size of a Senkaiman. From the shadows of the gate between worlds, a vaguely familiar mask appeared, the harsh white glowing in Hueco Mundo's atmosphere as Hirako Shinji stepped onto the sands in the middle of the charging hollows and the kid. "Aizen, fancy meeting YA here," Shinji called out with a wide malevolent grin stretched across the features of his mask as the hollows ground to a halt. The other hollowified Shinigami filed out behind the man, excluding the Kido master, though in his place was Tsubaki Tessai. "Well, this was unexpected. Kisuke sends his regards," Shinji added pleasantly, and Jin could feel the irritation that comment spiked in his gracious leader. Ichigo and the Shinigami were staring at the hollowified Shinigami in shock before the kid grinned, blindingly, Jin would argue, at the man and stated, "You did it. I suppose this is your family then?" One hell of a family, kid. What it was Jin wasn't exactly certain, but the vague notion and logical answer was that it was the opening of the Garganta. He elected to ignore the Shinigami's comment about the kid's family and debated whether he should use shins and kill the loose end. Though, at this point, the loose ends were really rather becoming a knot in the plan. Aizen had recognized that fairly quickly, if his Reiatsu was any indication. Everyone was still frozen, the hollows were waiting for commands, and a standstill had oriented itself between the two powerful factions on the barren stretch of Hueco Mundo. Aizen's lips curled in displeasure, and his hand drifted towards Koka Suigetsu, which had been sheathed exactly 13 minutes ago. There was nothing to grasp though, because the Zanpakuto was lying about 30 feet to the left where former Lieutenant Kuna stood with it. It seems I have misplaced my katana. Yeah, we weren't a fan of the whole illusion-type Zanpakuto. If YA don't mind, we'll be taking Ichigo and his friend now. Oh, and this probably caused a lot of activity, so Soul Society might be looking your way. Shinji replied to the mild comment with a twitch of his fingers over the hilt of his katana, and the hollow-fied Shinigami shifted around him into battle-ready stances. Well, it seemed the odds were stacked against them for once, though it was Urahara, so there was little there to be surprised about. Aizen's irritation bloomed sharp and stinging against Jin's skin, and he could almost see the plan his leader was formulating. With a nod, the hollow surged forward, Reiatsu crashing over the sands in a whirlwind. The hollow-fied Shinigami formed a wall sans Hirako, who turned to the kid and the Shinigami and began ushering them towards the Garganta that still stood crackling and gnawing on empty space. Now they couldn't let that happen. Jin disappeared in a burst of Shiimpa and appeared in front of Hirako, whose blade snapped up to meet his own. The blonde laughed even as he gestured for the other Shinigami to guard the kid. Ichimaru never did ditch the snake attitude, huh? Shinji commented, his voice distorted as their blades intercepted in a blur of motion, and behind them, Reiatsu roared through the air in an arc of burning power. Jin grinned, and with a flicker of his eyes he replied, more of an Ouroboros. The hollow-fied Shinigami hesitated for a moment at the word, and Jin pressed the advantage, pushing Hirako away from the kid. Perhaps Aizen would step in. Perhaps not. It wasn't Jin's concern. Their blades continued to clash as around them hollows collapsed into dust, and the hollow-fied Shinigami mowed through their forces. Karma. If Jin focused, he could sense Kuna leading Aizen on a chase through their surroundings, holding his scabbard and disappearing before the man could catch up. Physical fighter his boss was not. Then there was silence, and Jin was kneeling in the sand, panting thinly as a blade rested at his neck. They both hadn't gone into Shikai, and they probably could, but that would give away the game, wouldn't it? "It's about time to return home, y'all." Hirako called out to the other hollow-fied Shinigami in the silence where once an army of hollows had stood. They filed past Jin and didn't spare him a glance. It was all very professional and dramatic. Former Lieutenant Kuna appeared last, and they formed a semicircle around the kid. The masks over their features glinted in the moonlight. Aikawa placed a hand on the kid's shoulder and spoke to the Shinigami before he guided the two into the Garganta. That's when Aizen reappeared in typical dramatic fashion. Hirako hit the back of Jin's head with the pommel of his katana. It wasn't enough for unconsciousness, but really it did hurt, so Jin decided to fall forward and let the two fight it out for a bit. The other hollow-fied Shinigami fled into the tear between worlds till only Surugaki was waiting with her arms crossed and concern masked baldly on her features. Rising to his feet slowly, after what Jin deemed an appropriate time, he tightened his grasp on Shin's and joined the fight. Blades were flying as Aizen tried to drive them away from the Garganta, which was slowly beginning to shrink in size, and between Hirako, who swirled the motion of the fight towards the portal. Jin joining only added to the confusion as sand whirled through the air, and blades cracked and splintered against one another. He could almost taste the desperation from his former captain as the Garganta continued to shrink. It wasn't known whether the portal had been opened by one of the hollow-fied Shinigami or Kisuke, but Jin was placing his bets on the first option. What was Hirako afraid of then, Jin wondered. Surugaki was already gone, inside the portal, with the rest of them likely waiting for Hirako, because of teamwork or something. A burst of Reiatsu was all the warning Jin had before he plummeted to the ground as a beam of pure energy crackled overhead. He opened his eyes to peer at it as the heat transferred through his Shihakusho, a Sero. Well, that answered one question. In a burst of Shiimpa, Hirako darted towards the Garganta as Aizen rose to his feet and followed. Jin stood at a leisurely measure and listened to the scream of Reiatsu between the two as they raced forward. The Garganta snapped shut. Kenshi shuffled into the room after a few minutes, his spirit, Tachikaze, hovered behind his wielder almost menacingly. Ichigo wasn't quite certain who the spirit was attempting to menace. Lisa had just stalked out, so maybe that explained Kent's hesitance. But in Ishigo's opinion, the session with Lisa had been fruitful, a lot had been aired, and there may have been a table thrown, but at the end of it all, the normally stoic Visored had seemed happy. The grey-haired Visored glanced once at the doorway as if contemplating escape before he settled on the couch Love had dragged in. The first meeting after everything had been in the living room, it had been chaotic with the spirits yelling and talking, their wielders mimicking the same action. It was better for everyone to do it privately where there were no outside distractions and where Ichigo could focus on one spirit at a time. It was weird. Here he was, a 9-year-old attempting to give counseling to a couple of Shinigami who were centuries old. It sounded like something out of a reality show. But it was working, they were beginning to open up to their spirits, and it in turn had opened a whole new world for the Visored. Ichigo suspected that even without his intervention they would have eventually reached peace and negotiations. But he acted as a mediator where no one else could. He wanted to help the Visored and their spirits, his family. Seeing a weight lifted off their shoulders, the smiles that rang true, the way their spirits didn't just hover. It felt justified, and worth it. After all, they had done the same for him. Scrubbing a hand through his hair, Ichigo smiled in a welcoming manner at Kenshi, who returned the gesture with a faint curve of his lips. So, do you want to start with how you realized the bond between you two was wrong? We can try and go from there. Ichigo suggested, noting the way Tachikase was refusing to look at his wielder. It seemed that unlike Mashiro, who was an outlier and should not be counted, there was still some buried hurt. Kenshi huffed a bit at the request, but nodded, his own eyes following Ishigo's line of sight for a moment before it strayed to his own hands. We were fighting, beating each other bloody. And it just felt futile. It always happened that way, we didn't speak often before, it was all communicated with intent. I guess I realized that my intent had never been to accept it or to understand. It had been to win, dominate, as you said. I fought, I didn't let Tachikase win because that wasn't the answer. That was submitting. Instead, we came to a draw. Kenshi spoke slowly, searching for the words, in a manner that hinted at his penchant for thought that few knew of. His story reminded Ichigo of what the other Visored had told him of their own struggle to find a place of balance within their souls. It had all been about acceptance, taking away the cycle of hate and revenge, and apologizing. It was interesting how often they physically surrendered or tipped the power imbalance in their inner worlds. Kisuke would probably have a field day just theorizing about it all. Shinji had accepted Saken's blade, Lisa had let her spirit kiss her, he didn't really want to know or understand that one. Rose had succeeded the melody to his spirit to create a harmony, Love had let his spirit crush him into the ground, and Hachi had made tea. Hiyuri wasn't there yet, and Ichigo wondered if her relationship with her spirit would ever improve. Mashiro had already established contact with her spirit long before he had been kidnapped, but his kidnapping had been an impetus for her. I think in fighting to a draw you re-established your relationship. It became a partnership again, you are equal. Ichigo stated, something seemingly obvious, but Ichigo found that spelling it out sometimes helped. Kenshi furrowed his brow as he acknowledged the word, something like realization sparking behind his eyes. Tachikase stared at his wielder. The plates of armor that had once tightly bound him were gone, in their place was something lighter like chainmail, weaved strands of pale stalks that seemed to shift with an invisible wind. Kenshi, Tachikase started, and Ichigo understood he would soon be playing translator. In the real world, communication seemed easier. The large spirit continued, in the many years of silence between us, all that I could feel was hate. It was internalized in both of us to the point where I too was blinded. Ichigo relayed the words carefully, feeling the weight of the spirit's gaze, somber and honest in equal measure, testing and exacting of Ichigo. Zangetsu curled around Ichigo, glared protectively over his head like a cat, and he resisted the urge to laugh as he watched Kenshi process the words. The Visored across from Ichigo straightened, and for a moment he could see an echo of what had once been a captain of the Gotei 13. I'm sorry, Kenshi said, and the words were heavy with Reiatsu as the Shinigami stared at his hands and the hilt of his Zanpaku too. Tachikase blinked at the words, his appearance visibly rippling and shifting momentarily before the spirit nodded and spoke in return. Ichigo had a feeling everything would turn out all right between the Zanpakuto spirit and wielder. An hour later, Ichigo stretched as he stood up from the couch. Kensei had already left, his eyes red as he searched out Mashiro. Slipping the door shut with a quiet click, Ichigo basked in the warmth of Zangetsu's arms around his shoulders as he entered the living room. Shinji was leaning against the kitchen counter, the lamp overhead cast his hair and the tint of his eyes in gold as the man conversed with Lisa, who looked 5 seconds away from pulling her Zanpakuto on the man. Love and Rose were sandwiched together on the settee, arguing with Hachi over something, probably someone's taste in something. Mashiro was sitting upside down on the couch petting Kensei's thigh, where the man was determinedly pretending to read a book and wasn't looking at anyone. Hiyuri was in the kitchen and Ichigo was vaguely worried at the loud banging and the faint smell of smoke drifting from that area. Ichigo, which is better? Human vs human? Or human vs nature? Love called in greeting, flashing a bright grin as he waved at him. Ichigo furrowed his brows as he thought over the question and glided towards one of the seats. He was certain they had talked about this class at one point or another. Or Benihime had lectured something along the same line. Eventually, to a waiting audience, he answered, man versus society. Or man, that's just not fair. That wasn't even an option. Love complained even as Rose grinned triumphantly and Hachi shook his head with a demure grin. Ichigo smiled unrepentantly at the trio, earning a resigned look from Love, who shook his head and commented, we'll agree to disagree for now. Are you still coming down to train with us, Ichigo? Or will your father be upset? Rose questioned with a smile a beat after Love's surrender. Ichigo nodded and beamed at the two as he responded, definitely. You promised you would show me how you disarmed Hiyuri last time. Besides, I have a new technique I want to show you. And your father? Hachi added, his deep voice rumbling and filling up the room in a way that echoed home. Ichigo squished his lips together in a vague frown before he added, it shouldn't be a problem since tomorrow there's no school. In any case, Karen has a soccer game tonight, so I need to leave to catch that. They nodded and returned to their conversation, so Ichigo let his gaze sweep once more over the room. He felt safe, there were people, his family around him, it was warm and there were furniture and posters around him. He was home. He was safe. If Ichigo needed to keep reminding himself of that, if he woke up from nightmares of utter isolation, if he couldn't help but touch everything to see if it was real. Well, Ichigo knew that he would get better with time. Jumping to his feet, Ichigo padded over to Shinji and Lisa, the latter of which had descended into a cold glare at the blonde. Shinji turned to him with a grateful smile masked behind a grin and slung an arm around Ishigo's shoulder. Hey Ichigo, we were just talking about YA. Shinji stated in a tone that clearly conveyed that he had not been the subject of conversation. Lisa frowned at Shinji, but her expression softened upon landing on Ichigo and she tousled a hand through his hair. How are you doing? Lisa asked softly, bending so she could look into Ishigo's eyes, the reflection of light on her glasses highlighting the barely there smile at the curve of her lips. Ichigo shrugged and glanced away for a moment, his eyes searching out Zangetsu. Lisa didn't press, instead she ruffled Ishigo's hair once more, whirled around and glared at Shinji before stalking off. Ichigo giggled into his hand at Lisa's actions as Shinji scowled at her retreating form. You sure YA okay, Ichi? Shinji questioned, his eyes were elsewhere, and his fingers tapped an uncertain beat on the counter. Ichigo hummed for a moment before he replied, I think I will be, which is what's important. The man in front of him huffed a shaky laugh and bent down to wrap his arms around Ichigo, his reiatsu pulling itself close like a blanket. Ichigo ignored the dampness on his cheeks as Shinji whispered, we're not ever going to let that happen again, Ichigo. We'll protect you, and make sure you can protect yourself. Shinji pulled back for a moment and grinned, broad and full of teeth. Ichigo wiped away his tears and smiled back. X. Yuri felt Kurosaki's eyes on him throughout the class. They were there, piercing the back of his head as he dutifully noted their sensei's lecture on the water table and its economical variations. His notes were even and neat, perfect almost, and Yuri vindictively reminded himself that his father probably wouldn't care if his notes were the equivalent of chicken scratch. His eyes flickered towards the clock as he continued to feel the gaze of his classmate, Kurosaki's Reiatsu, which had always been a large presence, had been hidden somewhat recently, but it was there nonetheless, focused on Yuri. The bell rang sharp and shrill, the teacher halted in her lecture and glanced about lost for a moment before dismissing the class. Yuri placed his supplies away slowly, meticulously, and prepared to pull out his lunch before he decided that it was better to have Kurosaki confront him elsewhere so the whole class wasn't there to witness it. Yuri tugged his backpack over his shoulders. Leaving it alone for even a minute is a temptation too tantalizing for the local bullies to resist. Kurosaki and his large friend, Yasutora, followed behind Yuri in a manner that was far from inconspicuous. Yuri doubted it was on purpose. The young student paused outside the school gates and waited dismissively for his classmate to arrive. Briefly, he wondered why Kurosaki was seeking him out. They had never spoken within school, and Yuri only vaguely recalled seeing Ichigo at his aunt's funeral. Though they were cousins, it was hardly acknowledged among either family. Though there was the insistence a few weeks past where Kurosaki's younger siblings were at their house for a night, and Kurosaki wasn't at school for a few days. Perhaps it was related to that. Maybe the boy, in an idea of honor, had come to thank him for looking after his sisters. It would suit Kurosaki's character. The orange hair was visible from a mile away, as was the hulking form of Yasutora. Kurosaki halted in front of Ashido with an expression that was closed off, but a contrast to the harsh frown he often sported in school. Kurosaki. Yasutora, Yuri intoned, raising a brow in question. Kurosaki frowned and glanced around the area, his eyes sharp in a way that reminded Yuri of his father for a brief moment. Is there anywhere private we can speak, Ashido? Yuri was suspicious, and it must have shown on his features, for Kurosaki frowned and added, "It's about spiritual stuff." It was slightly surprising that Kurosaki knew about the spiritual world. He had never given such an inclination in their previous interactions. Yuri supposed it had something to do with his father or Yuri's heritage. Still, there was the question of how Kurosaki knew that Yuri was also aware of that world's existence. Nodding with a muted sigh, Yuri adjusted the glasses on the bridge of his nose and led the two into a small alleyway before turning to face them with an expectant gaze. Kurosaki frowned and stared at the opposite wall. Yasutora was a silent support behind the smaller boy. Kurosaki sighed once, his eyes dark in the shade of the alleyway before he began. "I suppose you noticed I was absent for a few days a couple of weeks ago." Yuri nodded. Kurosaki continued, "Well, to put it simply, I was kidnapped by a not-so-nice Shinigami and taken to Hueco Mundo." Yuri processed the information with a wide-eyed stare. Kidnapped? Kurosaki had been kidnapped. The idea felt ludicrous, and yet Yuri couldn't doubt the sincerity of Kurosaki's words. His thoughts warred with each other for a moment before he gestured for Kurosaki to continue. Yasutora settled a hand on Kurosaki's shoulder, and the smaller boy smiled gratefully at the giant of a boy, and he began again. "Why I was kidnapped isn't so important right now. When I was there, I escaped, and I ended up in the middle of Hueco Mundo with a Shinigami who had been there for a century alone, fighting the Hollows. An army of Hollows appeared, I was fighting the Hollows, and one snuck up on me. It probably would have killed me, but my Reiatsu did something different. Osen, my spirit, suggested I speak to you about it." It hadn't been obvious Kurosaki had been part of that world, the one his grandfather trained him in, but hearing Kurosaki's words he realized that the boy in front of him was likely far more involved than Yuri, and with the Shinigami. He couldn't help the bitterness that settled into his gut at the thought of them, but pushed it aside long enough to satiate his curiosity. It seemed that Yasutora was also aware of that world, for he showed no surprise at Kurosaki's story. Sighing, Yuri adjusted the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He wondered what he was getting into, and said, "Show me." Kurosaki blinked as if he hadn't expected Yuri to agree to his request. With a nod, the boy held his hand in front of him. Reiatsu called in the air, familiar blue Reiatsu appearing in his palm. It flickered like a small flame before guttering out. It made sense, Yuri supposed, if one knew anything about biology, which with his father's profession Yuri knew more than a little. Kurosaki's mother had been a Quincy. He knew this only because of the book with the family tree, so the likelihood of Kurosaki inheriting that bloodline as the firstborn child was extremely high. "I think you've managed to manifest the Quincy portion of your inheritance." "Again, plainly please?" Kurosaki requested, even as Yuri could see some sign of comprehension in Kurosaki's brown eyes. Sighing, Yuri reiterated, "Your mother was a Quincy. You know about our race, don't you?" Kurosaki nodded with a half-smile that suggested very little knowledge, and he continued, "It is likely that blue Reiatsu, different from your regular Reiatsu in whatever way you've identified, is from your mother." "My mom," Kurosaki stated in a tone that was familiar, though Yuri refused to acknowledge such. Yuri supposed it would be wise to at least introduce Kurosaki to Sken so that his grandfather could decide if Kurosaki had any potential. Yuri didn't hate Kurosaki, but he wasn't familiar with him as well. However, if Kurosaki had any potential as a Quincy, then it was Yuri's duty to try and preserve the tradition and culture of their race. A roar sounded at the end of the alleyway, surprising them all. For a moment Yuri hoped it was the school bell ringing and signifying the end of the conversation. He knew it was otherwise as he turned and materialized his bow, blue Reiatsu shifting unstably as he tried to form a proper bow. Kurosaki stared at it for a moment with wide-awed eyes before he also turned to face the hollow and unsealed katana materializing in his hands. Yasutora covered the rear, staring sightlessly at the alleyway before flicking his gaze to Kurosaki. The hollow lumbered forward, fast even for its large size. Yuri waited and watched as Ichigo darted forward, kicking into the air only to narrowly avoid a large fist as he kicked off the brick wall. Yuri gathered his Reiatsu and released the arrow. It split the air and lodged itself in the hollow's arm. It moved quickly in a blur and tossed Kurosaki overhead at Yuri. Yasutora rushed forward to stand in front of Kurosaki, arms held in front of him. Kurosaki pointed and spat out hasty directions, and Yuri watched somewhat astonished as Yasutora's fist landed a blow to the hollow's abdomen even as he readied another arrow. A roar split the mid-afternoon air as in a burst of Reiatsu Kurosaki leapt above the hollow and let his blade cleave through its mask. With a howl of wind that whistled through the alleyway, the hollow dissipated, leaving only the sound of their panting to fill the silence. The katana in Kurosaki's hand disappeared as the boy flashed a bright smile at Yasutora and Yuri, eyes alight with adrenaline and something else. For a moment, Yuri couldn't help but smile at his cousin's contagious enthusiasm. Yasutora hummed with a nod and stepped closer to Ichigo to check the boy over for injuries. In the distance, Yuri could hear the school bell ringing, summoning them back to classes. Yuri wanted to be mad at Ichigo, who had occupied all of Yuri's lunch, but the knowledge they had prevented a hollow from consuming an innocent soul eased the irritation. Ichigo turned to face the school building before his eyes flickered to Yuri, questioning and open like an outstretched hand between them. Adjusting the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, Yuri sighed and stated, "I suppose I should take you to meet my grandfather." X. In the low light of the shiten, the steam wafting from the food spread over the table whispered like smoke. Ichigo smiled proudly at the spread of mouth-watering food: misty miso soup ladled into small bowls, rice clumped together with pork laid out over it still sizzling, vegetables crispy collected into smaller serving dishes, a bright burst of color against pale gray cutlery, and a table full of people who were important to Ichigo. Yuzu, who was sitting beside Ichigo, was also smiling. They had spent half the day in the kitchen together listening to Benihime's stories as Ashido's spirit hovered nearby. The others stared impressed, and Ichigo wondered if this was how his mother had felt whenever she prepared a meal for them. He hoped she was proud of the meal, of the way they were showing their love for their family. Karen, squished beside their father, flashed the two of them a smile, the expression shifting her features from the frown that normally resided there into something youthful and bright. Their father was beaming, and Ichigo held little doubt that if they had been at home the man would have been blubbering in front of the giant poster of their mom. Ashido, seated to his left, stared at the food with wide disbelieving eyes, as if the sheer quantity alone was shocking. It probably was. The door slid open with a clack and Kisuke entered, fluttering a fan in front of his features even as his eyes widened with pleasant surprise at the spread on the table. Behind the man came Tessei, holding Jinta and Yururu under each arm. They were the same age as the twins and had simply appeared one day. Benihime wouldn't tell him if they were real children, though they certainly acted like such. Yoruichi entered last, as if an empress gracing mere mortals with her presence. She winked at Ichigo and glided to a seat. "Ma, this is quite a spread, thank you, Yuzu." "Ichigo," Kisuke stated as he settled into his seat with a flutter of his hari. Ichigo grinned in response as Yuzu ducked her head with a blush. Jinta and Yururu settled into their spots, Jinta with a wide grin as he devoured the table with his eyes, and Yururu with a shy smile directed at the twins. Tessai settled between the two with a nod at Ichigo. With everyone seated they began eating. The food was delicious, but Ichigo preferred to observe as everyone around him enjoyed the food. He listened silently to the adults quietly confer about new security measures they had placed on the town, Kisuke's inventions, Kido barriers, the occasional sweep, and guard duty. He listened to Yururu and Yuzu discuss the food and their favorite TV show while Jinta and Karen argued over which sport was the best. Ashido on Ishigo's side leaned over and ruffled a hand through his hair gathering his attention. "Thank you," the Shinigami said quietly and earnestly, his features open in the happy atmosphere of the Shiten, his spirit hover beside him pale grey cloth that seemed to shift into nonsensical patterns. Ichigo grinned at Ashido and replied quietly, "You're welcome. Try the tempura." Ashido laughed, the sound hearty and deep bounding from his chest above the light chatter. Ichigo was suddenly inexplicably happy that the Shinigami had agreed to stay in Karakura town at the Shiten. Ashido's dedication to his squad was more than admirable. It was something men as great as Kisuke would likely never accomplish, and Ichigo respected Ashido immensely for it. But everyone needed to return home. Eventually, the dinner wound to a close, the plates were cleared, and light chatter filled the air as Tessai returned from the kitchen with a tray of tea and coffee. Wordlessly Karen and Yuzu began to gather the dishes, speaking to each other without words and glaring at Ichigo when he tried to stand and help. The steady sound of water through a tap lingered in the background as Yoruichi began to debate with Tesso and Ashido over the proper way to cast Kido. After a moment, Ichigo felt his father's hand on his shoulder. There was something warm in the eyes that gazed down at him. They had never been close. Ichigo had always had mom and the twins had dad, but he knew his father still loved him. The crinkle at the corner of his eye seemed to say it all before his father turned away and headed into the kitchen to bother the twins. Kisuke slipped out of the room with a near-silent click that was only audible to Ichigo above Jinta and Yururu's conversation because he had been watching his mentor. Glancing at his hands for a moment, Ichigo shifted in his seat, his gaze flickered and casually observed everything. Eventually, to Zangetsu's gentle prodding, Ichigo rose to his feet and slipped out the same door following Kisuke. The porch was illuminated in golden light from a nearby lantern, and the silhouette of Kisuke, pale smoke curling in front of his features, and the viridian of his hari and hat held a tranquility that Ichigo couldn't place. He settled beside Kisuke in silence, feeling the chill of the night seeping through his t-shirt in the quiet between them. "Do you think he'll come after me again?" Ichigo questioned, tugging Zangetsu's hari closer to his chest in the cool air of the night. Kisuke beside Ichigo shrugged off his hari and placed it on Ichigo's shoulders. His gaze was on the stars above them, some already gone though they weren't able to see it. An invisible death so close to what Ichigo had almost experienced. Almost certainly, but not for a little while. He'll need to recreate his forces, and he'll have to tread carefully. Soul Society is aware that something happened in Hueco Mundo. It's likely someone there knows the exact details, and besides that, the Visored are now able to use hollow-based techniques. It certainly won't be easy for the man even with his Zanpack too. Ichigo nodded and ignored the disappointment the answer brought. He didn't ignore the fear because it was real and there was no point in ignoring reality. He would just become strong enough that he wouldn't have to fear. Aizen. Kisuke seemed to sense Ichigo's thoughts, for he was staring at him with those eyes that almost twinkled if they were not so cutting, and added, "We'll protect you, do everything in our not inconsiderable power to prevent it from happening again. And we'll make sure you're prepared. Soul Society will get involved too, won't they? Yes, the chips will fall. Now, 10 years, a century, who knows? But this Cold War has been brewing for a long time, Ichigo, and perhaps it runs even deeper than Aizen, a systematic problem rooted in Soul Society itself. It's hard to say. But because of who you are, what your heritage entails. I'm sorry, Ichigo, but you will be involved. It's how you choose to act that matters. Just know that we will support you every step of the way." Ichigo nodded and leaned into Kisuke, the smell of tobacco faint as the embers glowed like fireflies. He would protect his family, and if that meant going up against Soul Society and every other entity in the world, Ichigo would do so. A hand ruffled through Ichigo's hair and he gazed at the graveyard of stars and promised that his family wouldn't be eternal, but they would live and be all the brighter for it.